going here. Let me make sure and look at the chat here and make sure I didn't miss anything. Sarisha asks, is there a fixed percentage in the transaction, or does that depend on the state? Neither. I hate to answer an or question with neither, but both of the things you said there were incorrect, Sarisha. There is definitely no fixed amount, and it does not depend on the state either. It depends on the transaction. Every transaction from a compensation standpoint is going to be negotiated individually, always. It's and Jacqueline said, I believe it's up to 6%, but you can have a listing range from 4.8 to 6%. You can charge whatever you want to charge. Your firm can charge whatever it wants to charge. And as a matter of fact, we're going to talk later, and this is a really important point. If you're actually committing, you're violating a federal law. You're committing a felony if you tell a client that, oh, well, everybody else charges this 5%, but we're going to do it for 4.8. You don't talk about commissions in that regard. Commissions are individually negotiated between the firm and the client. And so there should never be a comparison of, what other people charge or what some standardized rate is, because there is no such thing. So hopefully that answers your question. It's a great question. And Jacqueline's answer is a great answer because that's the perception that's out there, but that's not true. There is no such thing as any sort of a standardized fee. As a matter of fact, it's illegal to have standardized fees when it comes to commissions. So,
okay.
Good question. All right, so let's talk now that we've kind of gone down the road a little bit of introducing agency. Let's talk about what agency is as far as a definitional thing. It says agency is legal representation by one party on behalf of another party. Now, here's what I want you to understand. This definition does not just apply to real estate transactions. Matter of fact, here's a question for you. Can you think of a more common situation even than real estate transactions or profession that deals with agency even more than real estate?
Attorneys,
agency?
athletes, attorneys.
Insurance.
Stocks.
Insurance. Well, it could be.
Lawyers.
The insurance agents represent the insurance company. I heard lawyers and attorneys.
Lawyers.
Absolutely on those. Why do we hire an attorney?
To represent us.
To represent us in a court of law, because we're afraid to do it ourselves. Could we represent ourselves in a court of law?
Yes.
No question. Why do we not do it more often then?
Because we don't know all the law.
Confidence.
We don't know the law.
Familiarity.
There's a high likelihood that we'll get a much worse result if we go in there unrepresented. You think that's a fair statement?
Yep.
Yes.
That we get a better result most of the time by being represented? And so think about that relationship. If a client hires an attorney, they're hiring the attorney to speak for them. They're not hiring the attorney to act for them. That's a different thing. Can we agree that speaking on behalf of someone and acting on their behalf are two different things? Can we agree on that?
Yes.
Yes.
Who ultimately is the decision maker? Is it the agent or is it the client? Is
Client.
it the attorney or the client? Which one?
Client.
It's the client.
Client.
What an attorney's hired to do is speak for the client, give advice to the client, advocate. That means try to convince other people that their client is right. Don't attorneys do that? Do a lot of trying to convince the other people in the courtroom or other attorneys or other parties that their client is right and their client should prevail. That's a lot of arguing is what they do. All of that is true of agency and real estate transactions as well. Here's the only difference. And it even works this way sometimes in the law, but it's just less common. In the law, most of the time, the client has directly hired that individual attorney. Sometimes they hire a firm. But in real estate, who has the client hired?
The firm. The firm.
As we talked about earlier, the client's hiring the firm. It says an agency relationship exists when two persons agree that one, the agent, so what can we substitute for agent there? Who's the agent going to be in a real estate sense?
Firm.
The firm.
Okay.
So the two parties have agreed that the firm will act on behalf of the other, which is the principal. They will speak for the principal. They will advocate for the principal. They will give advice to the principal. Principal is just another word for client. Ultimately, though, who's making all the decisions?
Principal.
The principal is. Are we all okay on that so far? That is the basic definition of agency. Now, I got to give you a little bit of a history lesson. Again, this is not something that's going to be tested, but it helps you to understand how we got to where we are. The current real estate license law and rules that we have, and they vary state to state, but right now we're talking generically. This would be true no matter where you are. Evolved over a long period of time. Nobody sat down and said, these are going to be the rules for real estate. Matter of fact, what if I told you that the National Association of Realtors, how many of you have heard of them? The National Association of Realtors was founded in 1913. When do you think the first real estate license was issued in the state of North Carolina? Anybody want to take a guess?
1913.
30s.
1958.
Wow.
So for the first 45 years that you could be a realtor, what kind of rules and license law were there?
None.
There were none. So the business had been going for almost 50 years before anybody thought, crap, we need some rules about this. And so the rules we have largely formed out of how the business was done at that time. And then over time, they saw problems and they adjusted the rules as they went. Does that make sense for everybody? And so what that does, it creates this situation where, quite honestly, sometimes we have rules that don't necessarily make sense with each other. We have things that when you look at them together, it's sort of like, well, why is that and that both true at the same time? Well, the reason is because those rules didn't always come into effect at the same time. There are things that are still legal in North Carolina, which very much you would not want to do from a practical standpoint, but they're still legal, and so therefore you have to understand them. So let's talk about where real estate agency started. Where did it begin? Who do you think was the first client to want to hire somebody to help them in a real estate transaction? Would it have been buyers or sellers or landlords,
Sellers.
tenants, or who do you think was first?
Sellers.
Sellers.
Seller.
If you think about it, the most natural role of a salesperson in any industry is to work for who?
Seller.
The person selling something. I mean, if you work for a car dealership, you're not working for car buyers, are you? Who are you working for?
The dealership.
The dealership.
And the dealership is the what in the transaction?
Seller.
They're the seller. See, remember how I told you to stop using, like you always want to say developer. I say, don't call them that. Call them the property owner, because you need to understand the same rules apply to any property owner. Well, don't call them the dealership in that case. Call them the seller. Call them what they are, because then you start to understand the rules apply the same to any seller. It was sellers who wanted help selling their property. So in the very beginning, what do you think the relationship looked like? Seller hired a realtor or a real estate agent, whatever we want to call them back then, to do what? Help them do what?
Seller
What
house.
does the seller hire them to do?
Sell their property.
Sell their property. I own this property and I want you to help me sell it. Folks, nobody knew what representation was. Nobody cared what representation was. What did the seller care about?
Selling.
Seller.
That's it. Find me a buyer and I will do what?
Pay you.
Pay you.
I'll pay you. That's the basis of our industry. Simple as that. Find me a buyer and I will pay you. Say that out loud. Find me a buyer
And
and
I
I'll
will
pay
I
you.
will pay you.
That is the bedrock, even still to this day, of our business. It's what the whole business is built on. Find me a buyer and I'll pay you. Does the seller care where the buyer comes from?
No,
No.
just that they have money.
Just that they have enough money to satisfy them and pay them for the property. Is everybody okay with that?
Yes.
And ultimately, who's still in control though? Who controls whether or not the property sells?
The seller.
The principal.
The seller does. They're the ones making the choice. They don't have to accept an offer just because somebody brings an offer, correct? Is that a fair statement? Nobody's going to hold them down and say, you have to accept this offer. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Yeah? So ultimately, the seller's in control. And they're only going to pay if the firm, the agent that they hired, an agent and firm are the same thing in this context, if they're successful in finding them a buyer. Is everybody with me on that? That is
Yes.
how real estate existed for almost 100 years. Unchanged. Find me a buyer and I'll pay you. I don't care where you get them. I don't care what you do with them. Don't give a crap. Find me a buyer and I'll pay you. That evolved into the idea that we represented the seller. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. Here's why it evolved into the idea that we represented the seller. We're greedy. We're selfish. Put yourself in the shoes of a real estate agent in 1920. Did you have any laws that said you had to take the seller's side? Did you have any laws that said you had to look out for the seller's best interest? What do you think the answer to that was? No.
No.
There were no laws. Well, then why did everybody decide to take the seller's side then? Because it was the seller that was what?
In charge.
Paying them. And it's natural to want to look out for the best interest of the person paying you. Is that a fair statement?
Yes. Mhm.
And it also had the side benefit of getting us paid more money. If we're paid a percentage of the sales price, don't we benefit if we're able to get a higher sales price for the seller?
Yes.
Absolutely. No doubt about it. There's a huge benefit there. Don't we benefit if the buyer doesn't ask too many questions about the property? If the buyer doesn't know some things about the property, don't the real estate agents benefit if the buyer just kind of goes in blind and just pays whatever the asking price is? Isn't that like the perfect buyer for not only the seller, but also for the real estate agent, if all the real estate agent cares about is getting paid money? Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
What do you think? Yeah?
Yes.
Now, the reason, the basis of our whole industry is that we represent sellers is because that's how it started. But even to this day, it is the basis for the industry. I'm going to challenge you to do something right now. And if you choose to do it, you will be so much better off in this class. If you don't, you will struggle with agency like no tomorrow. Until you know otherwise. Every real estate agent involved in a transaction represents who?
Seller.
The seller. By default, if you don't know whose side they're on, who do you assume they're working for?
The seller.
The seller. All of our laws are written that way. All of our laws are written that way. I want you to think about something that we talked about last week when there was a default, but there was another option. We talked about tenancy in common versus joint tenancy. Do you have to ask for tenancy in common, or do you just get it? If you don't specify what you want, do you just get tenancy in common? Or do you have to
You
ask
can if
for
you
it?
don't specify. You have to ask for joint.
You have to ask for
You have
joint.
to ask for joint. That's not what I asked you though. Do you have to ask for tenancy in common, or do you just
No,
get
it's
it by
automatic.
default?
No, it's
You
automatic.
just get it, right? You have to specify if you want the other one, which is joint tenancy, right?
Right.
Treat buyer agency the same way. Travis is out showing houses to the buyer. Who does he represent?
Seller.
The seller. Travis is writing an offer for a buyer to purchase the property. Who does he represent?
The
seller.
seller.
The seller. It's always the seller, unless you are specifically told. Is it possible to represent buyers? Yes, but it's not our default position. Our default position is representing who?
The seller.
Sellers. That is the basis of our industry. So now I'm going to teach you a license law rule that's way later in chapter 7. But we're going to talk about it right now, and it should make sense based on that conversation we just had. If I'm a real estate agent and I pick up the phone and I call another real estate agent and I say, hey, I'm calling you about 123 Main Street. If I represent the seller, do I need to tell that agent on the other end that I represent the seller?
No.
No.
No, because they should automatically assume that if I'm calling about 123 Main Street, that I what?
The seller.
That I represent who?
The seller.
Seller. It's always the seller, unless you're told differently. It's always the seller, unless you're told differently. So if I call another agent and I say, hey, I'm calling you about 123 Main Street, they should be operating from the standpoint that I'm calling because I am looking out for whose best interest?
The seller.
The sellers. So I don't need to say it. Is it possible that I could be representing a buyer that's interested in 123 Main Street?
Yes, that needs to be mentioned.
I got to say it. Because otherwise they're going to operate from the assumption that I'm calling representing who?
The
Seller.
The seller. So, license law test question. When do I have to tell another agent that I represent the seller?
Never.
Never.
I don't. When do I have to tell another agent that I represent the buyer?
Every time.
Always.
Immediately.
When you speak with them.
Immediately. As soon as I talk to them. There's a test question guaranteed right there. Does that make sense why it's that way? Is that clicking for everybody? Because by default, we are assumed to be on the seller side, and that is based on our history as a profession. Because in the beginning, there was no such thing as buyer agency. Anybody want to take a guess what year buyer agency became legal in North Carolina? Even
4 years ago, right?
legal.
2014.
It's not that recent.
1992.
1991 or 92.
1994. It's a relatively new thing. Up until that point, real estate agents didn't just represent everybody by default. Sellers by default, they only represented sellers, ever. It was the only person you were allowed to represent was a seller. There was no legal way for a buyer to have representation. Doesn't that sound crazy based on what we know now of the real estate industry? Would you say most buyers now have representation in transactions?
Yes.
Yes.
They do. But that's a relatively new thing. And all these laws and all these rules, folks, were written long before buyer agency existed. So when you look at a rule, you have to realize that rule was probably written when there was no such thing as buyer agency. And then they came back after the fact and they tacked on something that kind of sort of made it work with buyer agency. So buyer agency is always the weird one. It's always the weird one. Seller agency is much easier. It's much easier to understand. It's much more straightforward than buyer agency. So let's go back in time here. Let's say we're in I don't want to go back too far. Let's go back to 1985. 1985. Some of you were not born. A lot of you were not born. Some of us were around in 1985. If you had moved to Raleigh, North Carolina in 1985 and this, by the way, is not North Carolina specific, this is true nationally. If you had moved to Raleigh, North Carolina in 1985, and you needed somewhere to live, which most people do when they move to a new place, what resource would you have turned to figure out what things were available? What would be the most likely place?
Newspaper.
The newspaper.
Apartment got, yeah, newspaper. apartment.
Newspaper. By the overwhelming majority, most marketing was done in the newspaper for real estate. There was a real estate section in the newspaper, especially in the Sunday paper. And everybody who was anybody in the real estate industry had a page in the real estate section. What did they advertise on their page? I mean, in addition to themselves, of course, what did they advertise when they bought a page in the real estate section? Let's say that Jory moved to town in 1985 and Beverly was a real estate agent back then. What did Jory see on Beverly's page that caused her to call Beverly?
Houses on
Available
sale.
property.
Properties that were available. Does everybody follow me on that? So Beverly took out this ad in the real estate section and she listed some properties on there that were available for sale. And that got Jory's attention because she saw one she might have some interest in, and she's sitting there flipping, looking through the real estate section. Everybody with me on what's happening here? Now, Jory's a buyer, correct?
Yeah.
And she's calling a real estate agent. Now, put yourself in Beverly's shoes. Beverly had to pay for that advertising. It was not cheap. How did she choose which properties to advertise? Which properties is she advertising? Just random ones she found that are happen to be for sale? Which properties is she advertising?
The one she represents.
The ones she lists. The ones she represents the seller. The ones that the seller has hired her and her office to sell for them. Does that make sense for everybody? Because
Yes.
here's the thing, folks. That's the only ones that get her paid. She doesn't want to see Jory buy a house. She wants to see Jory buy one of her listings, one of Beverly's listings. Is everybody with me on that? Because back then in 1985, Beverly couldn't get paid for any property in Raleigh except her own listings. If she had 5 listings, she had 5 chances to get paid, and that was it. That's it. Because the only agency relationship that existed was representing who?
The seller.
The seller. So the only time Beverly could get paid is if she sold one of those 5 houses. That's a tough business to be in if you think about it that way, isn't it? Is everybody with me on that so far? But you need to understand that compensation structure, need to understand how that works. Okay? Now, Jory calls Beverly because she sees one of those listings and she likes it. Is Beverly going to set up a time to show Jory the property?
Yes.
Yes, because she wants to get it sold. So she sets up a time. Now, when she's showing Jory, the buyer of the property, who's she representing?
The seller.
Oh, the seller.
The seller. Because in 1985, it was only possible to represent who?
The seller.
The seller. You need to remember that moment because you're going to be so tempted on this exam. Beverly is a listing agent on 123 Main Street, and she's showing Jory a property. Oh, that's dual agency. Bullshit. It's not. If she was hired by the seller to sell the thing, how can she possibly do that without dealing with buyers? Of course she's going to deal with buyers. How does a car dealer sell cars? They deal with who?
Buyers.
Buyers. But that doesn't mean they represent the buyer. Who is Beverly representing while she's out there showing that property to Jory?
The seller. Me.
The seller. She's working for the seller's best interest only. Is everybody following me on that?
Yep.
I yell at you because it needs to really sink in. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that has to hit home. It doesn't matter that Beverly's working with the buyer, she's representing the seller. So everything that comes out of her mouth is in the seller's best interest. This is the most beautiful property. This is perfect for you. Oh, no, you shouldn't look at anything else. This is it. So let's say Jory doesn't like the property. Can Beverly show Jory other properties?
Yes.
No.
She can
Yes.
show her as
She's
many
less
properties.
than.
She can show her as many properties as she wants, but she's only going to get paid on 4 other ones. Which ones?
The 4 that she listed.
The 4 other ones that she has listed. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
So Beverly's not going to offer to drag Jory all over town and show her a bunch of other properties, because the only 5 she can get paid on are her 5 listings. Is she going to try to show her all 5 of those?
Yep.
She will. She's going to try. Let's suppose none of them work. This is the way the industry used to work. If you work at a used car lot and somebody comes on the lot and they test drive every car on the lot and they don't like any of them, what's your next step with that buyer?
What are the other ones that you're selling?
There is no next step, right?
Refer them
Not them.
somewhere else.
You're out of options. They're going to go where?
Somewhere else.
Somewhere else. And you're not going to get paid when they go get somewhere else. Somebody somewhere else is going to get paid. Does everybody follow me on that?
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly the way real estate worked. If Beverly showed all of her listings to Jory and Jory didn't buy any of them, Beverly just made no money. Does that get to be frustrating after a while?
Sorry, Beverly. Yeah.
It does. There was a ton of wasted time. And here's the other thing. In the time that Beverly spent showing Jory around her listings, is she going to have like natural conversations with her where she finds out why she's moving to town, when she's moving to town? Did she got a new job? Does she have children? Or, they're going to
should.
school? I mean, are those the natural kind of conversations you're going to have with somebody while you're touring those 4 or 5 houses?
Yes.
They're going to happen.
Yep.
So by the end of this interaction, Beverly has a very good idea, most likely, of Jory, what she's looking for, what she wants at that point. You think that's a fair statement?
Yes.
And it's completely useless because Beverly doesn't have a listing that matches it. That's 1985. Let's say Beverly is an innovator. She likes to think outside the box. You bear with me now. Is everybody with me?
Mhm.
So Beverly, as she is showing these properties, she's thinking to herself, you know what, I could kick myself. That listing last week, I went over there, that listing presentation. That's the perfect house for this girl. That's the perfect house for Jory. And I didn't get that damn listing. I didn't get it. Anna got it. Anna got that listing. And sure, I'm here. Jory's going to find that listing and she's going to buy that house. Could that happen? Could that cross Beverly's mind? If Beverly knew of a house that somebody else had listed that was perfect for Jory, could that cross her mind?
Yes.
Yep.
But up to that point, that knowledge had no value because the last thing Beverly wants to do is help a competitor out. She's not going to pick up the phone. She's not going to tell Jory, listen, I know somebody else has got the perfect place for you. Why don't you just go on over there? Here's Anna's number. Call her. She's got the perfect place for you. She is not going to do that. Because not only does that not get her paid, it gets her competitor paid. And now her competitor is going to look better and they get more listings while she doesn't get any. Does everybody follow me on that?
Yeah.
So she's not going to help. So there's a chance that Jory may never find the listing because she may not see Anna's ad. They may never get hooked up. It's inefficient for the buyers. It's inefficient for the agents. It's just inefficient for everybody. So Beverly's like, there's got to be a better way to do this. So she starts thinking to herself, what if I called Anna? What if I called Anna and said, listen, I got a buyer for your property over on Main Street? Well, of course, Anna's going to want the information. We can all agree on that. Anna's going to say, well, then give me the name. I'll call her. What do you think that conversation sounds like from Beverly's perspective, though? When Beverly calls Anna and says, Anna, listen, I got a buyer over here at one of my listings, and she'd be perfect for that house that you got listed on Elm Street. But what do you think the rest of that, fill in the blank after the but? What is Beverly going to say to Anna?
There's going to be
I want some of your money. I want a cut. I want some of that money. I'll be good. Because Anna's going to say, well, give me her name. Beverly said, oh, yeah, I will. Right after you agree to give me some of the money. I'm not giving you any of my money. That's my commission. That's what Anna said. And hung up on her. And after about 2 days, when she hadn't heard from nobody, She thought better of it, and she called Beverly back and said, "How much do you want, greedy?" And so they came to an agreement where Anna, because Anna had an agreement that she was going to get paid if she did what?
Gave her the name of the buyer.
No, that's you're jumping ahead. But what is Anna's ultimate agreement? How does Anna get paid?
Selling that.
Selling that property.
By who?
By herself.
Her seller,
The seller.
right? The owner of the property that hired her is going to pay her. Do they care how she gets it sold?
No.
No, they don't care if she keeps all the money or if she gives some to somebody else. They just say get it sold. Does everybody follow me on that?
Mhm.
Yes.
It's her firm's money. Can she agree to split it with somebody if she wants to?
Yes.
Yes. And so she comes to that agreement with Beverly. All right, Beverly, I'll give you, well, I'm just going to make up a number. I'll give you 25% of the commission, not a cent more. I'll give you 25% if this woman buys this property. Could that be an agreement?
Yes.
And once they make that agreement, Beverly gives Anna the contact information. Anna contacts Jory. Jory goes over and looks at the property. She loves it. She makes an offer. She buys it. And as soon as Anna gets paid by the seller, what does she do with that money?
Gives
Then this is money.
25%.
She
Split
gives
it.
25% of it to who?
Beverly.
Beverly.
To Beverly. Folks, Beverly just invented a new way to do real estate. Beverly just laughed all around town at every other real estate agent because here's what she's telling everybody. I got paid and it won't even my listing.
But we
Y'all dumb.
Yeah.
You only getting paid on your own listings. I got paid for Anna selling her listing. How stupid do y'all look? Somebody had to be first. Are you with me on that?
Mm-hmm.
Now let me ask you a question though, and it's a question we're going to revisit over and over and over. Who did Beverly represent when she was showing properties to Jory?
The
Seller.
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 Sellers. Who did Anna represent when she was showing listings to Jory?
Seller.
Nobody.
Sellers.
Yeah.
Who represented Jory in this whole deal?
Nobody.
Nobody. She had to look out for herself, correct?
Me.
Mm-hmm.
And that was relatively easy for Jory to understand because when she was looking at properties with Beverly, guess whose name was on the sign in the front yard?
Beverly.
Beverly's. Pretty clear. She represents the seller. When she's looking at properties with Anna, whose name's on the sign in the front yard?
Anna.
Anna. It's pretty clear that Anna represents the seller. Is everybody with me?
Mm-hmm.
Nobody thought that was a bad system. In fact, buyer agency would have probably never existed if we had kept that system. Now, does something like that catch on? Do other agents see that happen, and does that sort of become popular? What do you think?
Yes. Yes.
Because I tell you who learned it better than anybody. Next time Anna has a buyer who doesn't like any of her listings, what's she going to try to do? She's going to start looking for listings and everybody else's stuff and say, well, let me call, oh, look, Sarah's got one that'll work for her. Let me call Sarah and give Sarah and see if I can get this referral agreement from Sarah. Is everybody going to start doing this with each other?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yes.
And it becomes very common. But again, everybody's representing who?
The
seller.
seller.
The seller.
The seller. Buyers getting bounced from agent to agent to agent, but they always dealing with the listing agent. That's who they're always dealing with, the listing agent. Is everybody with me?
Yep.
Fast forward to 1989. Not much has changed from the buyer's perspective in 1989. These years don't matter, by the way. I'm just making years up. But fast forward to the late 80s, early 90s. Not much has changed from the buyer's perspective. They moved to town where they're still most likely looking for listings.
Newspaper.
The newspaper. This is pre-internet. They're looking at a newspaper. And who's advertising in a newspaper? Listing agents. They're all listing agents. So the conversation starts in exactly the same way. So here's what happens now. New buyer, Michelle, moves to town, and she sees one of Beverly's listings and calls Beverly. Same process starts over again. And Beverly meets her out there and shows her the property and shows her all her available listings. Michelle doesn't like any of them. Now, Beverly, she's the master of this trick now. Is she gonna be pumping Michelle for information during these showings? Is she trying to figure out exactly what would work for her?
Yes.
Because she realizes that not only does she have an opportunity to get paid by selling her one of her own listings, if she can figure out who to pair her up with, she can also get paid that way, right? So she's really trying to like dig in. What do you like about this? Oh, what would be better for you? And now she's going to start furiously looking through that same real estate section in the newspaper, seeing who might have a listing that works for that. Is everybody with me on that? Because by the way, that was the only way other agents knew who had listed what. They looked at the same real estate section that the buyers were looking at. There was no way for them to share information and listings. But she's going to do that. And so she finds a couple. And one of them is Anna's. Same two that started this whole thing. So Beverly calls Anna up. Now, they've done this thing dozens of times since then over the last 4 years. So it's just a normal phone call now. Beverly's like, hey, Anna, I got a buyer for you. Normal, you want to do the same normal 25%? And she expects Anna to say what?
Yes.
Yes.
She expects Anna to say yes, but Anna don't say yes. And like, now Anna's thinking outside the box. Anna said, no. No, Beverly. I'm tired of giving away my money, to be real honest with you. I thought this was a pretty good deal. We did it years ago, and now I'm having to give away this money on just about all my transactions because you done opened up Pandora's box here. Everybody's doing this mess now. Now, does that make listing agents mad when they go from making all the commission to now having to share it on every transaction? You get a little bit persnickety about that, don't they?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So here's what Anna says. Beverly says, so you're not going to pay me? Well, I'm not going to give you the person's contact information then. Anna said, I didn't say that. I said I'm not going to pay you the way we've been doing it. I'll pay you. As a matter of fact, I'll pay you even more. I'll give you half the commission.
If
I'm
you
just
do
making
this
numbers
now.
up. I give you half the commission. But here's the deal. Because Beverly loves that now. Beverly excited about the idea of getting half the commission from Anna. She is. Here's what Anna says. But here's the deal. I'm not showing that property. Don't send me their name and number. I don't want it. You drag your happy butt over here to my office, and I'll give you the key, and you take them over there, and you show them the house, and you answer all their questions. And if they like it, you write up the offer. And if they buy it, then I'll give you half the money. How's that sound? What do you think Beverly said?
Yes.
Beverly, yeah, I'll do that. I'll do that. Now, this is an important juncture right here. Put yourself in Michelle's shoes. She got in touch with Beverly because she was looking for a place to live. She saw one of Beverly's listings in the newspaper. She called Beverly. Beverly showed her one of her listings. Showed her several of her listings, and it didn't work. Now, Beverly's going to pop up, and here's what the buyer's experience is going to be. Hey, Michelle, I'm sorry I didn't have anything to work for you, but listen, I've got a couple of other options which I think are great options that are listed by other agents in town. And if it's okay with you, I'd be willing to take you over there and show you those and see if it would work for you. That way you won't have to worry about calling somebody else or finding another agent or, looking back through the newspaper. We can just jump in my car and we can run over. I can pick up the key. I'll make all the arrangements and I'll show you the properties and see if they work. How does that sound to you? What do you think the buyer's going to say to that when they hear it presented in that way?
Great.
Of course, that sounds way better than having to call all these different people, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So that's what they do. Michelle gets in Beverly's car, and they go over and they pick up the key from Anna, and then they go to Anna's listing. And Beverly shows Michelle Anna's listing. Whose name is on the sign out front?
Anna's.
Anna. So does Michelle understand that the person showing her the property is not the listing agent? Does she clearly understand that?
Yes.
Now here's my question, and this one matters. What does Michelle naturally start to assume then is her relationship with Beverly? Who does she assume that Beverly is working for in this transaction? She's riding in Beverly's car. Beverly is helping her find a place to live, even so nice as to help show her other people's listings. Listings where clearly she's not the listing agent, and she's willing to do all this for me, the buyer. Who does she begin to assume that Beverly represents?
Herself.
The buyer. And guess what was not legal?
The buyer.
Buyer's agent.
Buyer representation. So who did Beverly actually still represent, because it was the only legal way it could work?
The seller.
The seller. So here's what we have at that point in time. We have a huge disconnect where you have buyers being drug all over the country in hundreds of thousands of real estate agents' cars, from listing to listing to listing, when the buyers assume that the agent that's working with them is representing the buyer's best interest, but they're actually representing whose best interest?
The seller.
The seller's, because that's the only way it legally worked. Is it dangerous for a buyer to be with somebody who's working against them, but assume that person is working for them? Is that a dangerous dynamic?
Sure.
Yes.
Yes. Go back to the attorney dynamic. If you have a defense attorney because you've been accused of a crime, would it be dangerous for you to walk into the courtroom and sit down on the wrong side, assuming you were talking to your defense attorney, and find out later that you were talking to the district attorney? Might you say something during that conversation that you would not say if you knew you were talking to the district attorney and you thought you were talking to your own attorney? Could you say something that could harm you severely in that
Absolutely.
conversation?
Absolutely.
Same thing is true in a real estate transaction. What happened was, because Michelle was in Beverly's car and Beverly was dragging her all over creation, showing all these other people's listings, Michelle became trusting of Beverly. She started to place her trust in Beverly. And she started to say things like, well, you know, I like this one a lot, but, you know, I don't know. I'd probably pay full price, but do you think they would take a little bit less? What do you think would happen if I offered it a little bit less? I do want it, though, so I would pay full price. Michelle thinks she's dealing with somebody who's looking out for her, correct?
Yes.
Beverly, meanwhile, is on whose team?
The sellers.
She's on team seller. So she's going to sit right there and listen to all that, is she not?
Yep.
And when Michelle writes up that offer for a little bit less than list price, and Beverly takes that offer to Anna, what's the first thing that Beverly's going to say?
She's willing to
give more.
This fool, she sat right there in the car and told me she's willing to pay full price. Just counter offer with full price. She'll accept it. She already told me she would accept it. That's dirty. That's just dirty. There ain't no way around it. But that's the way the law worked in 1989. Because everybody represented, all real estate agents represented who?
The seller.
Seller. That's where the federal government finally got involved. Because the federal government said that most states operated on this idea of caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. In other words, sellers are not responsible for protecting buyers. Buyers are responsible for protecting themselves. But that becomes really unfair when buyers think they have somebody helping them, but that somebody is not actually helping them. They're working for the other side. Does that make sense? They're like I call them the secret agent, right? They were just, you know, the buyer had no idea this backdoor dealing was going on. And so the federal government stepped into the situation and basically threatened all 50 states and said, you have to clean this mess up. You have to fix this. You have to stop these sellers agents from running around showing buyers properties and the buyer thinks they're working for them. You have to put a stop to that. You've got to shut it down. You've got to find a way that the buyers either clearly know that the person they're dealing with is working for the seller, Or what do you think the other alternative was? What's the other alternative? Okay, either
Agency.
shut it down and don't let sellers agents take buyers around to other listings, or you come up with laws that make it clear that everybody represents the seller. Or what was the third option? What do you think the option that most states chose was? If the buyers thought they had representation, then what?
They should have
Represent the buyer.
representation.
Then why can't they?
Right.
Who the hell said they couldn't?
Mhm.
Just because we never done it doesn't mean we can't do it, and that's where buyer agency came from. Buyer agency came from, does that help a little bit to understand how we got to where we are, to get a little bit of perspective looking backwards? That's where buyer agency came from. So now we operate on a time period where it is very common in most real estate transactions, just like it's very common in most court cases, that not just one side has representation, but both sides have representation. And what that means is that, okay, the seller has hired a listing firm. That's what we call the firm that the seller hires, the listing firm. We say we take a listing. A listing is a representation agreement with a seller and a firm. We call the firm that represents the seller the listing firm. And most transactions have a listing firm. Does every transaction have to have a listing firm?
No.
No, the seller may choose to be a what?
For sale by owner.
For sale by owner. They don't have to hire, but most transactions, the seller does choose to have representation. Okay. Does every transaction have to have buyer agents?
No.
No.
Buyers could choose to be unrepresented. They have that choice. Buyer does not have to have representation. But what's most common now? What do you think the most common transaction is now? One where
Both parties are represented.
both parties are represented. And I'm going to go one step further. Based on what we said this morning, that discussion you had in your groups, who did we say the seller is going to be hiring? Are they hiring an individual agent or are they hiring a firm?
The firm.
They're hiring a firm. Who do we say a buyer would be hiring? An individual agent or a firm?
Firm.
A firm. Let me ask you a question. If you really want somebody who's going to look out for your best interest, somebody that you can bare your soul to, that you can tell anything, and they will never use it against you. They will always look out for what's best for you. They will always do the right thing for you. Are you going to look to hire the same group of people to represent you that are representing the other side? Or should you probably look to hire somebody different?
Somebody different.
If you're getting a divorce, do you hire your soon-to-be ex-husband's attorney to also represent you in the divorce? Or would you say that's a crazy conflict of interest? We could never do that. What would you say?
No.
The conflict.
That's a crazy
Conflict of
conflict
interest.
of interest. So I'm just going to ask you just straight up. What firm is in the best interest of the buyer? Any firm other than who?
The sellers.
A listing
Than the
firm.
listing firm, the seller's firm. Anyone. Pick one. Just not who.
The listing
Sellers.
firm.
Listing firm.
Listing agent.
Because if you hire the listing firm, doesn't it stand to reason you are dealing with the snakes? You are throwing yourself intentionally into the viper's pit. You know these people are already working for who?
Seller.
Seller.
The seller. Before you ever met them, they were working with the seller. They swore to the seller they would do what was in the seller's best interest. Why the heck would you hire them if you're thinking about it logically from a buyer's perspective? Does that make sense for everybody? You'd hire somebody who's going to work for your best interest. That's what agency is. Agency is hiring somebody who's going to look out for your best interest. And so where we are now is the situation where it's very common for both parties to have representation. We've already talked about this several times, that the client is hiring the firm. That's the agency relationship. The agency relationship is between the client and the firm. We have this other relationship. What do we say the second relationship was? Between the firm and who?
The broker.
Broker.
Individual agents, licensees, brokers within the firm, however we want to refer to them. Absolutely. Do the individual agents, brokers, licensees have any direct relationship to the client? Or does that all flow through the firm?
It flows to the
Flows
firm.
to the firm.
Both
It
to the
all
firm.
flows through the firm. The firm is at the center of everything. Who's working for the client? The firm. Who's getting paid by the client? The firm. Who's doing the work for the client?
Broker.
The agent,
Brokers. But they're not actually doing the work for the client. Who are they doing the work for?
the firm,
For the firm. So who's going to compensate them?
firm,
Firm.
Who's doing the work for the client?
the firm,
So who does the client compensate?
the firm.
The firm.
So now tell me how the money flows.
From
From
client.
client to firm, from firm to broker.
Broker. Every single time. That's another license law question you might be asked. A seller after closing wants to give their agent a bonus. Oh, you did such a good job, here's $500. What should they do with that money?
Give it back.
Give it to where?
Get rid of the firm.
Give it to the firm. It doesn't belong to them, it belongs to the firm.
Even if are there any firms that give 100% commission?
There are.
And it still works the same.
Still works the same. It's got to go to the firm first. Flows through them. Because ultimately they were the ones hired by the client. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
Okay, good, good. We've already talked about everything on this. The law of agency is just all the laws that we deal with when it comes to how to represent somebody else, how to speak up for somebody else. Again, we don't act mostly on behalf of our clients. And I want to be clear about this. We can be given permission to act on behalf of our clients. Can I accept an offer? Is it possible, theoretically, for me to accept an offer on one of my listings?
Yes.
Is it theoretically possible, me as a listing agent, I could be the one to decide, okay, this is the offer we're going to accept? Is that theoretically possible? What do you think?
So, if they give you permission,
If they give us permission. It's just very rare that they give us that level of permission. Most of the time, they only give us permission to what? What are they giving us permission to do most of the time?
sell their
Sell
house.
houses.
Well, but sell our house, that's accepting an offer. What are they really giving us permission to do?
To do whatever the clients decide is best to be done.
Yes, but what are we doing? What are we
Writing up
doing?
the offer.
Giving advice. Give
We're
advice.
giving advice. We're speaking for them. We're marketing for them. We're negotiating on their behalf. But ultimately, who's making all the decisions?
The principal, the client.
The client is. Can they give us permission to make the decisions too? What do you think?
Yes. They can.
They can.
Or
In
will,
writing,
but they won't.
with a written contract. And there will be times when they'll do that. Probably not in a sales transaction. How about rentals?
Property management.
Property management. Who makes the decision? If I'm managing a property, if I'm managing an apartment complex, who's going to decide what tenant to accept? Is the landlord going to make that decision on every individual tenant, or are they going to probably give that authority to the property manager?
Property manager.
Property manager.
I'll give it to the property manager. Who's going to be deciding what the amount of the rent is? Is the landlord going to decide that, or are they probably going to give that authority to the property manager?
Property
Property
manager.
manager.
Property
Property
manager.
manager. So as an agent, is it possible for us to be given even more authority?
Yes.
Yep, absolutely. And we're going to talk about those different levels of authority as well, and what it's called to have those different types of powers. So here are some terms that you're going to likely see a lot of in these agency chapters. We already talked about agency. It's just a relationship right here. Agency is a relationship. And you could probably add the word written. It's a written relationship when one party is hired to act or speak for another party. The principal, we've already said, means the same thing as client. They are interchangeable completely. People struggle with this word subagent. This one right here throws people for a loop sometimes. I just want to focus on the first three letters here. What does that prefix sub mean?
Below.
Below.
Below, right? A subway is below the normal road. A submarine is below the water. Sub means below. Who's the agent of the client?
Firm.
Firm.
So who is one level below the firm?
Broker affiliated with the client.
The licensees that are affiliated with the firm. So when you see this word subagent, all that means is the licensees who are affiliated with the firm that represents that client. If the client hires a listing firm that has 100 agents, how many agents does the client have?
100 and something.
Just one.
One
The
agent.
firm.
Is the firm.
But how many sub-agents do they have?
100.
120.
They have 100. The firm is their agent. The brokers or the licensees are their sub-agents. Because the brokers or licensees don't work directly for the client. They work one level lower. They work as sub-agents. Does that make sense for everybody? Are we kind of getting that?
Yeah.
No, Cassie? All right, talk to me. What do you not get about that? You're still muted.
Yeah, I was muted. So the sub agent you said is the agent like I'm just confused.
Sub-agent is agent of the agent. That's the literal translation. But it's just one level below the firm. The firm is the agent. Who does the client hire? They hire the firm. So the firm is the client's agent.
Okay.
That is who the client has hired. If you just look at who the client hired, that's their agent. Well, they hired the firm, so the firm is their agent.
Okay.
Who works for the firm?
The brokers, all of the brokers.
And we call them sub-agents.
So it's kind of going back to the flow, like the flow of
It's like a flow chart. That's exactly right. That's all it is.
I got it.
Now, so that better? Okay. So now let me point out a phrase you might see often. And then I want you to tell me, y'all to help me with what it means. The phrase, he's working as a sub-agent of the seller. You'll see that. You'll see it on the test. You'll see it in the real world. Travis is working as a sub-agent of the seller. Well, of the seller, that just means for the seller, right? Representing the seller. Does that make sense for everybody? And we know what the word sub-agent means now. That just means I am an agent of a firm. Is everybody with me on that?
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think the phrase sub-agent of the seller means? It tells you exactly who Travis is. He is a licensee who works for the real estate firm that was hired by who?
That client.
The seller.
By that seller. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So if you were trying to identify, in other words, if you're looking at real estate brokers in a transaction, and there are two of us, Travis and Seth, whoever, and you wanted to say, okay, well, Seth is a sub-agent of the buyer. What does that mean? He works for
The firm that
hired
represents
by
the buyer.
the buyer. Travis is a sub-agent of the seller, just means he works for the firm that was hired by the seller in the transaction. Does that make sense for everybody? And that's how we label people. They are either sub-agents of the seller or sub-agents of the buyer. That's how they're labeled in transactions. Listing agent would be another word you might need. Which one do you think the listing agent is? Would that be a sub-agent of the seller or a sub-agent of the buyer?
Of the seller.
Of the seller.
Of the seller. Does that make sense? Now, here's where you're going to get thrown for a loop. I'm warning you, it's coming. It's like a roller coaster. You see the loop-de-loop coming. It's right here. You're about to get flipped upside down. Can I work with a buyer as a sub-agent of the seller?
Yes.
Yeah.
Open houses?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Have to.
Absolutely. If I take Tasha and I show her one of my listings because she's a buyer and she's interested, am I working with a buyer?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, but not for them.
Do I work for her?
No.
No, I'm just working with her. I'm showing her the property. Can I answer her questions?
Sure.
Yes.
Yeah. If she wants to make an offer, can I pull out the offer paperwork and help put the offer together?
Yes.
Yes. I'm working with the buyers. Everybody follow me on that?
Mm-hmm.
But I'm the listing agent. So who am I a sub-agent of?
Seller?
Seller.
Sub-agent of the seller. Now here's what Tasha needs to know about that relationship. She better be real quiet. She better watch what she says. Because everything she says, who's going to hear?
The buyer or the seller.
The seller. Because my job is to look out for the best interest of that seller, to relay information to that seller. My job is not to give her advice. Can I help her put together an offer? The answer is yes, absolutely. Can I give her advice on that offer? What do you think the answer is? No, because I owe all my advice to
The
Or
seller.
so.
to the other side. So that's somebody working with a buyer as a seller sub-agent. Does that make sense for everybody?
Mm-hmm.
The reverse is also possible. If I'm hired as a buyer's agent, so I'm a sub-agent of the buyer, and they want to look at a for sale by owner listing, well, who do I have to contact directly? There's no agent to contact, so who do I have to contact?
The
The
seller.
seller?
The seller. So I'm working with a seller as a
Sub-agent.
Sub-agent of the buyer.
of the buyer.
Right.
Are we getting there on that a little bit? Yeah. Okay. So just don't assume that just because I'm working with somebody, I mean I'm working for them, because they're two different things. Fiduciary, fanciest word in the class, from as far as vocabulary words go. Fiduciary. A fiduciary is a relationship of trust. It's a trust-based relationship. This word goes with clients. Our clients are our fiduciaries. We have a fiduciary relationship with our clients. Somebody mentioned they were in insurance. I think was it you? Who was it? Tyler? Was it you that was in insurance? And we talked
Yes.
a little bit about fiduciary responsibilities, right, Tyler?
Yes.
And as an insurance licensee, it's a little bit different. In most cases, for example, like if you sell a life insurance policy, to whom do you have a fiduciary responsibility? Is it to the person buying the policy, or is it to the company who's issuing the policy?
That's me.
In insurance, it's usually to the company, right?
Company.
Yeah, the company. In real estate, it's not so clear. In real estate, we have to be told, oh, they either represent the seller or they represent the buyer, and each is possible. But we only have a fiduciary responsibility to clients. We don't have a fiduciary responsibility to everybody. That's going to be one of the most important distinctions where you're going to see test questions in this chapter, is this different treatment of clients versus this word down here at the bottom, customers. A client and a customer are not the same thing. You should probably repeat that to yourself about 15 times. A client and a customer are not the same thing. As a matter of fact, they're exactly opposite things. Clients are fiduciaries. They are people we represent. That is somebody we are hired to look out for their best interest. We will always do what's right for our client whenever possible. They can tell us anything, and we will keep it confidential as long as we're not required to disclose it by law for some reason. That is not true of a customer. Customer is the exact opposite of a client. Customer is somebody you work with, and you may have a great relationship with them. Matter of fact, you probably hope you have a great relationship with them because you need them, but you don't represent them. So I'll give you an example. Let's say you have a real estate licensee who sells new construction homes, and they work all day long in a model house. Our buyer's going to come in there pretty routinely. and have questions and want to be shown around. What do you think?
Yes.
That's the whole reason they're there, right? When the buyers decide they want to buy, who's going to help them put that offer together? That on-site agent, correct?
Mhm.
Who's going to help them choose what color and what level of countertops and whether they want to do upgraded cabinets and do they want to do the hardwood floor upgrades? Who's going to help them make all those choices?
Seller agent.
That on-site agent. I heard somebody say the magic words, the seller's agent. Because even though they are working with that buyer is not their client. Who's their client?
Seller.
The seller.
Mhm.
The buyer is their customer. The buyer is the one on the other side of the transaction. The customer is anybody we deal with in a transaction that we don't represent. If I represent the seller, the buyer is my customer. If I represent the buyer, the seller is my customer. But also other people. The closing attorney is my customer. The lender is my customer. A builder, if they're not the seller, might be my customer. The home inspector would be a customer. Anybody I deal with in the transaction other than my client is a customer.
A cleaning company you hire when someone moves out, they're your customer, correct?
I'm sorry, say that again, Beverly.
The cleaning company that you hire when someone moves out of a house, they're your
Absolutely.
customer.
They're a customer. That's exactly right. So, if I have one client in a transaction, but many customers in the same transaction. We're going to talk a lot about today, this afternoon, the different treatment between clients and customers because we owe them very different things. We don't treat them the same. So they're very important to know the distinctions between those things. Are we all good there?
I have a question.
Go for it.
So with the customer and client, so like how you said earlier, you'll go out with someone at least one time and show them a house before you actually like have a written agreement with them. So would they be considered a customer initially? And then once you get an agreement, they become a client?
Yes, that's a really good question, Justine. So if I go out and I show people property and we don't yet have an agency relationship, are they my customer or are they my client? And the answer is they're my customer. Until we create an agency relationship, they're my customer. And so at that point, I may not have a client in the transaction, right? And which is true. If I'm showing some other firm's listings, well, the seller's not my client. If I don't have a buyer agency agreement, the buyer's not yet my client. So everybody's a customer to me at that point. And does that, so let me ask you a follow-up question, Justine, and everybody. Does that have some danger for the buyer too? Because I think we tend to think of that, oh, that's dangerous for the agent. Why would they want to go out showing properties, and not have a written agreement? That's dangerous. They could go use somebody else. And it is dangerous for the agent for that reason. Is it also dangerous for the buyer?
Yes.
If you're showing them property and they're just a customer, one of the things you don't owe them is confidentiality. So everything they tell you is presumably fair game if you needed to use it against them down the road. So there's some danger to them in that relationship as well. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's better for everybody from a protection standpoint to get to the point of having an agency agreement. So real good question.
I have one more question. So
Sure, go ahead.
in terms of timing, if you, in that example, you are a customer as a potential buyer and not a client yet or a fiduciary, and then down the road you become one, does that then go all the way back to the original? Or if you showed that house before you were the official agent, does that prior conversation, is it confidential?
That's a great question, and it is retroactive. So if you start to show a buyer around with just a customer relationship, and then they decide, okay, I'm ready to commit, I'm ready to hire you, then every conversation you've had with that person becomes confidential.
Okay, that's what I thought. Thank you.
Absolutely. Which is great for them, right? And I tell buyers that all the time. If I have a buyer who's reluctant to sign a buyer agency agreement, one of the things I tell them is, well, just for your own protection, You really shouldn't go around and deal with a bunch of real estate agents and tell us all a bunch of confidential information, because only one of us is going to eventually represent you, or only one firm is going to eventually represent you. And that's the only one who has to protect your confidentiality. So you really need to pick one and stick with it. That's one of the selling points of signing a buyer agency agreement. So on the slide you have here now, it says the levels of agency. Here's what I want you to think of. These are power levels. How much power do we have? How much authority do we have as an agent? Remember, the definition of agent is just anybody who's been hired to represent somebody else in a transaction. Anybody who's been hired to represent somebody else in a transaction is an agent. So we have to have some differentiations of agents, because we don't want to just make a blanket statement. Oh, I've hired Darius as my agent, and then assume that Darius can do anything on my behalf. If it worked that way, let me ask you a question. Would you want your real estate agent to have the authority to liquidate your 401k, your retirement plan? Would you want your real estate agent to have the authority to just go to the bank and take all your money out of your 401k and then blow it on a weekend vacation to Vegas?
No.
To go get coronavirus? No. You would not. You would not want your real estate agent to have that level of authority. So we need some differentiation. We need some graduated levels of authority. Does that make sense for everybody? We need different types of agreements to say, this is how much authority I'm giving you. No more, no less. And we're going to talk about these in descending order. So, this is like, plus power here, and then this is plus power, and then this is just a little bit of power down here. We're going to talk about these in descending order. The top one, universal agency. Theoretically possible for a real estate agent to be given universal agency. But that's what we just talked about. Then they would have the ability to liquidate your assets, sell all your stocks, put your children in boarding school, take your children out of boarding school, give your children up for adoption. They could do all of that if you gave them universal authority. So I can't think of a reason why a real estate agent would be ever given this much power. But I can tell you that this exists in the law. I'm going to kind of differentiate this here. This exists in the law, and it does happen. How many of you have ever heard of something called an unlimited power of attorney? How many of you ever heard of something like that? An unlimited power of attorney. When does that normally happen?
When someone's unable to sick parents.
People's parents maybe get to a point where they're not capable of making decisions for themselves. Maybe you have some other person in your life who's been diagnosed with a mental disability and they don't have the capability of making their own decisions. People get
someone who may be mentally unstable.
Somebody mentally unstable. People get really sick, and because of their illness, they can't make their own decisions. There are lots of reasons why somebody might want to give this complete authority over to someone else. But understand, this is complete authority. So this should never happen unless the person giving up control has absolute trust in the person they're giving control to. So do you think this is likely in a real estate related setting? Is any person likely to give this much authority to their real estate agent?
No.
No. That's universal agency. Next step along the way is something called general agency. General agency is a lot of power in a limited way. General agency is sort of like pick something and say, you have power to do this, but everything else comes through me. You have the power to make decisions for me about this one thing, but not everything else. Property managers have this power. Property managers are general agents. By the way, that's a test question. If I ever heard one. What level of agency do property managers usually have? And the answer is general agency. Because if you think about property managers, do they make some decisions on behalf of their client, the landlord? Do they make some of the decisions about the property? Such as what? What decisions do property managers make?
Like the rent income, who the tenants can be, and then
How much to charge, who can stay there, whether to evict them. All those decisions are usually made by the landlord. Maintenance, repairing the property, by the property manager. The landlord gives that authority over to the property manager. Now, does that mean the property manager has the authority to go to the bank and take all the landlord's money out? No, that's the difference between general agency and universal agency. Does that make sense for everybody? This is known as a limited power of attorney. I still have power of attorney, the power to make their decisions, but it is what?
Limited.
Limited. So let me ask you this question. My sellers don't want to attend a closing. I'm representing sellers and they decided they don't want to go. But there are some documents they have to sign at the closing. And they say to me, can't you just sign for us? What's the answer to that question?
No.
Is it no?
It's written in
Yeah.
the contract.
Yes. You can sign it and notarize it, and
It could be yes, but
Yes.
It's written in the contract.
if they give me what?
power of attorney.
Written
or no.
permission.
But don't just call it power of attorney. That's not
Not written.
specific enough.
Written.
Are they
Written
gonna
power of
give-
attorney.
But are they going to give me unlimited power of attorney, or are they going to give me limited power of attorney?
Limited. power.
Limited.
They're going to give me limited power of attorney. What do you think that power of attorney is going to say? Travis has our permission to do anything we want,
No.
anything he wants?
No.
Or is it going to say Travis has our permission to sign the closing documents for 123 Main Street at this office on this date at this time?
Just to close them.
It will be
It's going to
specified.
be very specific about what I have the right to do on their behalf. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
That is general agency or limited power of attorney. And then we get to special agency. Special agency says limited to representing the principal in a specific transaction. And here's what I'm going to say. Speak and advise. When you have special agency, you have the ability to speak on behalf of your client. You have the ability to advise your client, but you do not have the ability to act for your client. Sales agents, sales brokers are almost always special agents. If I get a really good offer on one of my listings, can I accept it, or do I have to present it to the seller and see if they will accept it?
present to seller.
Presented to the seller.
Present it to the seller and see if they will accept it. Because even though I have agency with this seller, I don't have enough authority to make the decision. I have special agency. What would I need in order to have the authority to make the decision?
General agency.
Limited power of attorney.
So which one is that called?
General agency.
Agency.
I would need general agency, right? If I wanted to have the ability to make that call, that one specific call, I would need general agency or limited power of attorney. Does that make sense for everybody? Okay. So in real estate, which level of agency do you most commonly see in real estate? Special, general, or universal?
Special.
General.
Special by far. Special. General, relatively limited. Property managers, and that's about it. Every once in a while in a sales transaction, you see general agency.
So are you saying that for the sales broker to be able to sign on behalf of their principal, that they have to be a general agent?
That is right.
Okay.
That's exactly what I'm saying. So usually, Dinah's question was, because she gave her a little faint on my end, so I'm not sure if that was true for everybody. Make sure everybody heard it. As a sales agent, do I need to be a general agent? Do I need to have general agency in order to sign documents for my client at a closing? And the answer is yes, I do. So I probably already have special agency with them. The listing agreement itself at the very beginning gave me special agency, but it doesn't give me the right to sign those documents on behalf of them at closing. So most likely I'm going to get from the closing attorney a separate power of attorney, a limited power of attorney that would allow me to sign on their behalf at closing. Okay.
Does this change within every transaction, or is this always the same? Like you're always going to be a special agent, or you're always going to be.
When you're in a sales transaction, you're almost always going to be a special agent. When you're a property manager, you're almost always going to be a general agent.
Okay.
I mean, 99% of the time on each one.
I think I'm just a little bit confused as to why would a property manager have more power than a sales broker? That just doesn't make sense to me.
Why did the landlord hire the property manager in the first place? Did they hire them just to find tenants, or did they hire them to actually manage the property? Like
manage the property.
Deal with it.
Because a lot of times they're not there to do it.
They don't want to deal with it. They don't want to deal with choosing tenants. They don't want to deal with maintenance and making the decisions about when to do maintenance and not to do maintenance, and when to evict somebody and not to evict somebody, and what tenants to accept. They literally want to look at their property manager and say, just bring me a check, show me the money, and get out of my face. And in order for the property manager to accomplish that, they need a lot more authority than a sales agent would be.
That makes sense now. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. It's just a function of what the client wants, really. I mean, now, could I be a special agent as a property manager? Yes. But I'd be very ineffective, because every time I had to take applications on a unit, who would I have to take all the applications to and get them to decide who we accepted?
Landlord.
It would be the landlord. When I was trying to set rent and negotiate rent, I would have to go back every time to the landlord. When an air conditioner breaks, before I could schedule somebody to come out and fix it, I'd have to call and get the landlord's permission. I would drive the landlord nuts as a special agent property manager.
Question about the special agency when it comes to real estate brokers or sales brokers. Do both parties have to be at closing, or the papers can be notarized and signed ahead, and then the broker can just present it the day of closing?
Documents can always be signed and notarized. They don't have to be done at the closing. I mean, once they are signed and notarized, that means they've been done in front of a notary, so they do not have to be there. But there are some documents which are handled at the closing itself, which require the signature of both parties. So that means either both parties have to be physically there, or one of the brokers has to be given permission to sign on behalf of one of the parties. And that's most commonly the seller. Like the settlement statement, the money statement, has to be signed by all parties in front of the settlement agent. Because that's basically everybody saying, we agree, this is how you should disperse the money. And so that needs to be signed. And generally speaking, sellers don't want to come to the closing just to do that. And so they will give a limited power of attorney to their agent to sign that settlement statement on their behalf.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yep.
You have a question in the chat when you get a moment.
If you have a listing that is because someone died and their family does not live in town, would you be a general agent if the family doesn't want to make any decisions on the property? That's a great question, Jacqueline. And yes, you could be. If the family said, we just trust you, get it sold, and maybe they even give you a very specialized type of general agency. Could they say any offer above $300,000, you have our permission to accept it? Could we have general agency that would be tailored even that much, right? We could. It's still general agency because anytime they're telling me I can accept it, I can make the decision, that's general agency. And so, yeah, you can do that. Absolutely. It's just rare in a sales transaction that happens. It's general agency is rare in sales transactions and very common in rentals and property management. And they'll probably ask that on the test, like which you normally see. That's probably a pretty good point to take a break because we're going to start to jump into the different types of agency and different fiduciary responsibilities. So why don't we do lunch? It's 12:30 now, so say 1:15. 1:10, 1:15, right in that range. We'll come back for lunch or from lunch, and that'll give you a good breaking point. All right.
I have a question.
See you then. Okay, so when we hello, how are you?
Good.
Good.
Just had a good lunch. Thank you. Hope you are.
About time you spoke up today.
Whatever. I've been multitasking so bad today, but hello, everybody. I haven't spoke much today.
Y'all see what he does. He just does nothing all day.
Whatever. Get to work.
So when we broke for lunch, right before we broke for lunch, just kind of a recap, we had talked about the different levels of agency. That's where we left off, the different sort of power levels you could be given by a client. That's going to be on a case-by-case basis. Of course, there are trends. We talked about the fact that sales agents are mostly special agents and property managers are mostly going to be general agents. But make sure you know those. You will almost certainly see a test question about the different levels of agency power, so to speak. But we want to talk about now these things that we owe our clients. They're called fiduciary responsibilities. Like, what do we owe to our clients? And so I want you to just kind of think out loud. You can throw it in the chat, you can speak up, but I want you to think for a second. Give me some examples of the kinds of things our clients trust us with, either information they trust us with or things that they rely on us to do for them. Give me some examples of trust that our clients put in us.
Terry said honesty.
Honesty, yep. Loyalty, what else?
Follow through.
I think I heard somebody say money.
Money. I think Deborah said follow through. Is that what you said, Deborah? I think.
Yes.
Yeah, money, follow through, get the best deal for them. I see Jory put over there and Shane. Anna said trying to get them the most money. I assume she means on the seller side, because on the buyer side, we want to, have them in for the least money. But get all the information from the customers and relay it to them. That's a good one. Debbie said in all caps, disclosure. It's a big one, big deal. And all of these are great examples of things that our clients trust us to do. Advocacy, knowledge, addressing their needs. I mean, all these are great stuff. The test will test you on knowing these duties that we owe to our clients. And these are the ones that you might see on the test. And you can remember them in a couple different ways. You can remember them with loads, which is what you've got on your slide here. But you can also use something called old car, which just puts them basically in a different order. Oops, didn't mean to do that. Let me back up. You can do old car, OLDCAR. Whether you like loads or whether you like old car, I prefer loads. It doesn't matter. It helps you remember the duties that we owe to our clients. Now here, that's the most important word on here. People get so caught up in the duties that they forget this is what we owe to our clients. Before lunch, we talked about the fact that there are two different groups of people. There are clients, but there are also what other group of people?
Customers.
Customers. We do not owe these duties to customers. So if I ask you, are we supposed to be loyal to everybody? What would your answer be?
No.
Our clients.
No.
No, we're loyal to our clients, but not to customers. So let's talk about what each one of these means. Loyalty. Loyalty and confidentiality are the same thing. Loyalty and confidentiality mean basically the same thing. That's why there's one extra letter in old car versus loads. Because loyalty and confidentiality go hand in hand. When you're loyal to someone, that means information that you know about them. And this is most certainly going to come up as a test question. Information you know about your clients. What do you do with that information? Personal, confidential information that you know about your clients. What do you do with that information?
You keep it secret.
Keep it secret. So give me examples of some personal, confidential information that we might know about our clients that we would never disclose to some other people in the transaction.
How much they're willing to pay or how much they're willing to get.
Willing
Their income.
Anything to do with finances.
to pay.
Reason for selling.
Reason why they're selling. Oh, said that.
To accept. Motivations, like why they're selling
Yes.
or why they're buying. Personal issues. All of those are really good examples of things that we would keep as loyalty. Terry said, need to sell it ASAP, as soon as possible. Exactly. Because let me ask you this question. This drives me crazy sometimes because I see it in the MLS. By the way, I didn't mention this earlier, but I probably should. When we were having that discussion about how the real estate business evolved, it all started with everybody being sellers agents and then eventually making our way to buyer agency. The MLS came along during that time. Did anybody know what MLS stands for, by the way, what it's an acronym for?
Multiple listing
Multiple
site.
listings.
Multiple listing service.
Yeah.
The reason the MLS was created was not to market property to the public. When we started to show each other's listings, even before buyer agency became legal, but once we started to show each other's listings, agents wanted a way to know what other companies had listed, so they didn't have to just go to the newspaper. They wanted more detail. They wanted a way to say, okay, here's everything I know about this property that I have listed in case you need to show it to a buyer. And that was the whole reason for the MLS. The MLS was created as a way that different firms could share their listings with each other. Here's another thing I'll tell you about the MLS. What do you think its most important function is for real estate agents other than just sharing information? What do you think the most important function of the MLS is today for real estate agents other than sharing information?
To see what's on the market first.
Okay, see what's on the market. Important, but not the most important.
Knowing the commission the
commission.
seller's agent's willing to pay the buyer's agent.
Money. That's exactly right. Remember that system where we're willing to show other people's listings is based largely on them being willing to what?
Share their money or
Compensate
commission.
us in some way, share the commission. Does that make sense for everybody? How annoying would it be if I had a buyer who wanted to go look at 5 properties today, and they were all listed by 5 different firms, and I had to call and talk to all 5 agents, ask them if they were willing to share their commission, negotiate how much they were willing to share, and get a written agreement that says they'd be willing to pay us that if our buyer bought that property? Would that make buyer agency sort of a pain in the ass to deal with?
Yes.
It would take all day.
Just setting up the showings, forget the actual showings, just setting them up would take a day. So what if I told you there was a computer system that everybody could be a member of if they chose to as a licensee, and that your membership in that system guarantees that you would pay other members the amount of commission you say you're going to pay? That you could just go in there when you put your listing in the MLS, not only can you put the information about the property, but you can put right in there, this is what I'm willing to pay if you bring me a buyer. And that becomes a contract between the 2 firms. Just the fact that they're both a member of the same MLS. That's the function of the MLS. It's all about sharing the money. Now, do we use it for other purposes? Absolutely. But the big function, sharing the money.
How far out does an MLS like span to? Does it like, as far as it go like county to county, or like how does that work?
I'm spilling stuff on myself. It really depends on the area. It largely depends on how diverse your area is, how big of a metropolitan area you're in. There are some MLSs that are literally just one town, and some that span several counties. Like Triangle MLS is the 5 counties in central North Carolina: Wake, Durham, Orange, Johnston, Chatham, primarily. It also covers Granville County and Harnett County and some others, but those are primarily the ones that are covered by Triangle MLS. But then there's one very large geographic one in the eastern part of the state, which covers most of the coast and a good part of eastern North Carolina. It varies.
I mean,
Lake Gaston has its own MLS.
So like, for example, whenever we're going through the MLS, are we going to have access to literally all of the MLSs, or are we just going to have access to the one that our office or? You
have access to everyone you're willing to pay for. Gotcha. And they all bill separately.
Oh, lovely.
Okay.
Yep.
Did you saying you were in contract with them? Do you still have to get a contract when you work with them?
I'm sorry?
You mentioned before, if they're in the MLS, there's a contract.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean?
It means that your membership in the MLS is a contract. In other words, if you're a member of the MLS and you put your listing in the MLS and you say you're willing to pay a firm 3% of the sales price for bringing you a buyer, then if somebody else who's also a member of that MLS brings you a buyer, you have contractually agreed to pay them that 3%. They don't need to get a separate agreement with you.
Okay, good.
It doesn't mean you've promised to pay any firm that brings you a buyer.
Right.
3%. Only those firms that are members of your same MLS. And so it's one of the reasons that residential real estate agents almost always become realtors, is that the MLS systems are owned and operated by the Association of Realtors. And they own the MLS. And the only way you can join the MLS is to be a realtor. And so let me give you some insight into the difference. I don't have to be a realtor. I could choose not to join. But if I wanted to show 5 properties today, I'd have to contact 5 listing agents. And I'd have to make arrangements for compensation on each one of them. And I'd have to make arrangements for how to get into the property. Because how do you think you access lockbox codes and all those things? Guess where you would find all that information?
MLS.
In the MLS. Or there's a system I can join, which would allow me in 3 minutes to set those 5 showings, know I already had the contracts in place for my compensation, and provide me with the codes to show the properties. So what decision do you think most people are going to make when it comes to whether or not to become a realtor? If they work in residential real estate, you're going to be a realtor, because otherwise your life is awful.
So with the, excuse me, so with the lockbox, you don't have to pay like a monthly fee?
Depends on the type of lockbox.
Okay,
Some electronic ones charge a monthly fee.
okay.
Depends on the system.
Is that paid by the firm?
Ha 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 ha! Who's got jokes today? No,
It just made me laugh.
I know
nothing.
MLS is not paid by the firm. And
Nothing's paid by your firm. They pay you no mind. That's it.
Oh my gosh, Deborah, I am not laughing at you. I'm laughing at Travis.
Oh, that's all right.
Oh no, you'll pay all these fees.
Why doesn't the firm pay any fees?
Because you're an independent contractor. You're not their employee. You're an independent contractor.
But wouldn't it make more sense for the firm to pay for it, and then since everyone will be using it, like I'm sorry, I don't understand.
Why would it make more sense for them to pay for it when they make you pay for it?
I mean, that's true, but still.
You could potentially, I mean, they could potentially be paying them for
No, I'm
100
still wondering
different.
how it makes sense for them to pay for it from their perspective.
Since we're an independent contractor.
I mean, all they gotta say is no, you pay for it, and you're gonna pay for it because
Yeah,
you
'cause,
can't
I mean,
join their
that's-
form. You can't join their firm unless you're a member of the MLS. They'll probably have a rule that says to be a member of our firm, you got to be a member of the MLS. So pay for it.
How much does it cost to get into the MLS?
About $1,000.
That what? What'd you say? I'm sorry.
About $1,000.
5,000?
1,000.
Oh, I thought you said 5. I was like, hold up, now you better stop.
1
Okay.
And don't you have to pay quarterly?
I thought he said that too. I was getting ready to just click exit the class.
1,000 monthly.
No.
And fee?
No, it's about 1,000 annually.
But then, is there not a quarterly fee?
That takes into account all of them. There's several. There's annual fees, and then there's either quarterly or monthly, depending on how your MLS dues. But most of them total up to be somewhere between $1,000 and $1,500.
You just kind of get used to them as they come along.
Do you pay them when you're provisional or?
Indeed, you do. Yes, you do. You pay them as soon as you join. As soon as you join, if you join a firm that is a member of an MLS, then you join the MLS immediately.
Got it.
Because the MLS won't allow the firm to have members that aren't members of the MLS.
Right.
They'll kick the whole firm out.
When you join the real estate association, what else other than MLS, other than the MLS, would a person have like access to or could profit from?
What other benefits are there to being a member of the Association of Realtors?
Yes.
They provide you with contract forms to use in contracts, with tools to complete market analysis for your clients, with the ability to set your clients up on automated searches for listings. It's a huge piece of, it's the most effective marketing money you'll ever spend being a member of the MLS.
And is that included in the $1,000 annually, or each one of those is a separate fee?
No, that's generally.
So it's $1,000 to join the association. Okay.
Yep. And all of those are benefits of being a realtor. Yep. All right. So we talked about loyalty. Part of loyalty, or following loyalty very closely, is obedience. Obedience. Well, this is the one that I find the females in the class are experts at. Y'all understand this? I don't know why I obey. Like, so no. Obedience. What does that mean?
Follow their direction.
Follow their directions. That's exactly. Do what I say. We owe our clients. Remember, these are duties that we owe to our clients. We owe our clients obedience. Do we owe customers obedience?
No.
No.
We do not. We don't owe obedience to our customers, only to our clients. Now, I'm going to point out this phrase right here. We must follow what kind of instructions?
Lawful.
Legal.
Lawful, legal instructions. It does not say to follow all instructions of your client. There will come a time when you will have a client tell you to do something that's not legal, largely because they don't realize what they're asking for is illegal. Now, I know what pops in your mind when I say that. You of course, if your client tells you to rob a bank, don't do that. Okay, that's not the kind of illegal we're necessarily referring to. Yes, that is true. Don't rob a bank if your client tells you to rob a bank. But there are other things which to clients seem absolutely natural, but which are very much illegal. And it's up to you as the expert to know where that line in the sand is. So let me give you an example of something that could happen in the real world. Let's say Seth has a listing and he gets multiple offers. He has 2 offers on his listing, and one comes from Candace and the other from Deborah. Now, they're both buyer's agents, so they both represent buyers. They've both brought offers to Seth. Now, Seth, as a listing agent, has obviously seen both offers, correct?
Yes.
So if there's one that's better, he knows which one is better or higher. I mean, he has an idea. He presents both offers to the seller. And the seller, Elizabeth, says to Seth, well, listen, why don't you do this? Candace's offer is a little bit better than Deborah's offer. Why don't you call Deborah and tell her she's behind and see if she'll raise her offer? Just let her know we have a better offer than hers, and maybe she'll raise her offer. Is that something that a seller might want you to do? Is that something that you can imagine the seller saying to you, hey, why don't you do this? Can you imagine that?
Heck yeah.
Yes.
In fact, to sellers, that seems the most natural thing on the planet, to create this bidding war. Well, that's very illegal in North Carolina. It's called shopping an offer, and it's not allowed. And so we are responsible for knowing where the line in the sand is on legality versus illegality. And so even if Elizabeth were to say to Seth, I don't want you to call Deborah and let her know she's a little bit behind, we got a better offer than hers, Seth would have to say, Elizabeth, I'm sorry, I can't do that. I can inform Deborah that we have another offer, but I can't tell her we have a better offer. Or I could tell Deborah we had a better offer, but only if I first got whose permission. Whose permission do you think Seth would need if he was going to disclose to Deborah that there was another offer and it was better?
The higher offers client.
The other person's offer that they were disclosing. That's exactly right. So think how that conversation's going to go. Hey, Candace, thank you for your offer. Look, listen, here's the thing, Candace. We do have multiple offers here. And I'm just wondering, would it be okay with you if I told the other buyer what your offer was? What's Candace going to say to that?
Nope.
No.
No, of course not. So we just have to tell your client, no, I can't do that for you. It's not a legal command.
Teresa also mentioned asking for the code to the house.
Yep, I saw that in the chat just now. Teresa said, the clients may ask, hey, well, just give me the code. If you can't meet us over here, why don't you just give me the code and we'll let ourselves in. That'd be another example of an illegal act, and you wouldn't be able to follow through with their instructions. Okay, so that's what obedience means. Keeping their personal information confidential, following their lawful instructions. We also, somebody mentioned money. We owe them accountability, making sure that we are looking after their money, that we're taking care of their money, that we're doing all the right things with their money. That's accountability, and we owe that to our clients. It's their money after all. we're safeguarding it. If we're holding it, we're going to talk a lot more about trust accounts and the rules about trust accounts.
I
Sort of as we go through the class.
It's funny because I actually already know a little bit about trust accounts because of I used to work at a law firm, and
Right, you mentioned that, right.
one of my coworkers was actually a trustee, and he had trustee accounts, and every time pre-bills came out for attorneys, you would see these trust accounts associated with his clients. So yeah.
Yep. Well, and a trust account is sort of what it sounds like. It's an account where you've been trusted to guard somebody else's money. And so we have rules. So here's what I want you to put in your notes about trust accounts. And we'll just start with this as the general rule. We're not going to talk about them in detail right now because we'll talk about those rules later. But here's a general rule of a trust account. If you touch money in this business, it goes into a trust account. Period. That's the general rule. There will be a couple of exceptions because there's always exceptions to every rule. But the general rule is, and because this will drive you crazy in the real world, people say, well, do I have to put that in the trust account? Do I have to put that in the trust account? What's the answer?
Yes.
Yes. Yes. It's got to go in a trust account. If you're collecting rent on behalf of a landlord client of yours, where does it need to go?
Trust account.
In a trust account. So here's a test question for you. We haven't even done landlord and tenant. We haven't talked about property management. You don't even know anything about it. Answer this question. Can a tenant make a rent check payable to the landlord and you go pick it up from the tenant and then take it and deliver it to the landlord or put it into the landlord's bank account? Can that happen? What do you think?
Yes.
Yes, you could. You would have to deposit into a trust account, though.
Is it
I said payable to the landlord.
Oh,
No.
No.
Is that possible?
No.
No. If it touches your hands as a real estate agent, what does it have to be payable to?
The trust
account.
Your trust account. And it has to be deposited in your trust account. And then if you want to give the money to the landlord, you have to pay it out of your trust account to the landlord. Money goes into a trust account. Simple as that. Okay, that's the rule of thumb.
But it's your trust account, not the landlord's?
It would be your trust account. It's not the landlord's trust account because you're the one entrusted with holding the money. You can't be entrusted in somebody else's account. So it's your trust account or your firm's trust account, and you are the ones entrusted with their money.
So does every broker have a trust account to their own, like to their self, or does it typically have like the firm has one trust account that
Most brokers do not. One of two things. Either their firm has one and they have access to the firm's trust account, so they don't have to have one of their own, or they don't handle money. What's another? People ask me that question all the time. Do I have to have a trust account? Well, not if you don't what?
Handle money.
You don't handle money. And you can be a real estate agent without handling money. It is quite possible.
So for our
It's common.
commission checks, how would that work?
Commission checks are different. That's not somebody else's money.
Okay.
That's money that belongs to the firm, and you are collecting it on behalf of the firm. That's fine.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, that's not a client's money. Good question. Okay, we all good on that idea of accountability? Accounting? All right. So we talked earlier about the fact, and I left some notes on here that I had written from a previous class. We talked earlier about the fact that to get paid, you have to have what kind of an agency agreement?
Written.
A written agency agreement. And that's why you need them in writing. That's called an express agreement. Now, you can technically have an express oral agreement, but that's still not going to get you paid. The only way to get paid is to have an express written agreement. Express just means you've actually laid out the terms. Technically speaking, you can lay out the terms orally, But if you want it to be binding, you want to actually get paid, you have to put it in what?
Writing.
In the writing. There's another type of agency that they may test you on. So I would pay attention to this for test taking purposes. Something called implied agency. What does it mean when you imply something? What does that word mean?
Basically, it's just assumed.
It's assumed, right? And how many of you are familiar with the old expression about the old cliche about what happens?
Making an ass of you and me.
Right, you make an ass of you and me when you assume, right? So if implying and assuming mean pretty much the same thing, and assuming is not necessarily a good thing, would you say implied agency is probably a good thing or a bad thing?
Bad.
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 It's a bad thing. Implying agency means you act like you are somebody's agent, even though you are not really. And that's very dangerous to the public. You should never imply that you represent someone unless you actually represent them. I'll give you an example of how that might happen. Earlier, I mentioned that we automatically represent the seller without, any notice. I don't need notice of that because by default we represent sellers. And I said, if you represent the buyer, when do you have to notify somebody that you represent the buyer?
Immediately.
Immediately, so they know you're on the other side of the fence, correct?
Yes.
What if Seth were to call another real estate agent about one of their listings? And he would just begin the conversation by saying, hey, this is Seth. I'm calling you about, your listing over on Seabrook in Cary. I had some questions for you about this. By not saying he works for the buyer, has he implied something else?
That he's
Working for the
seller.
seller.
He's implied that he's working for who?
The seller.
The seller. If it turns out down the road that that's not true, he could be guilty of misrepresenting his position in the transaction. He can be held responsible for that. Because the other agent on the other end of the phone may deal with him differently because it wasn't clear whose team he was on. They may make the wrong assumption. Don't ever act like you are something you're not. If you don't have a listing agreement, then you're not the listing agent. Don't go to a party and say, oh, I got this new listing coming up. I caught myself from doing this earlier today. It's hard. It's hard not to. I have a lady who has contacted me and said she wants me to list her house for sale. And we went over commissions and everything. She said, that's good. Go ahead and send me the paperwork. When can we take pictures? And so I sent an email to my photographer. And I said, Randy, will you be available? I got a house in Clayton. I need to have pictures. I need to have air photography drawn, the works. And he got back to me, and he said, and he gave me dates, and he said, how much is it going to be listed for? And I responded back to him that, oh, we're going to probably have it on the market for, and I put a number. As soon as I almost hit send, and I stopped myself. Nope, I can't do that. Because by even just sending some email like that, I've insinuated I'm already representing that seller. Does that make sense? Because I'm now marketing their property at a certain price. And I know he's not looking at it in that manner because he's looking at it as, okay, what do I need to do to get the pictures taken for this thing? Because I'm hiring you to do that. But I have to be very careful to make it clear, I don't yet have this listing, here's my position. And so implied authority is a really dangerous situation. Don't put yourself in that situation. Are we all good on the idea of implied authority? So you only act like you represent people that you actually represent. How do we end an agency relationship? How do we terminate one? Terminating and ending are the same thing. how do we create an agency relationship? Let's ask that question first, because sometimes I think people forget that before how do you create one?
Mutual agreement.
Mutual agreement in what?
Writing. Written agreement.
In writing, mutual written agreement. So what we mean when we say terminating agency is how do you end that written agreement between the firm and the client? How does that go away?
It expires. It has a date.
It has a date. That's one of the ways it can go away. An expiration date, right there. That's
Mutual agreement.
So what does mutual agreement mean?
Both parties agree to terminate agency.
Both parties say we don't want to work together anymore. The firm and the client just don't want to work with each other anymore. That's a mutual agreement to terminate. That would end it. What else?
Sell it or complete it.
So yeah, it's completed the agreement.
Isn't this the best one?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
The best way to complete an agency agreement is to accomplish the goal, right? To finish the job. If we're hired as a listing agent, sell the property. If we're hired as a buyer's agent, help them buy a property. That's the best way to end or terminate an agency agreement. I mean, we've got other stuff here. We could have a breach of contract. Operation of law just means a judge does it, court of law. They can do anything they want to. I want you to pay attention real quickly to the last two down here. Destruction or condemnation of the property. So if the property is destroyed or condemned, if the property is destroyed or condemned, would that end an agency relationship? So you have a listing agreement, the property is destroyed by a tornado. Would that end the listing agreement?
Yes.
Yes.
It would. It would. Everybody with me on that? That would end the listing agreement. Because the thing you had been hired to sell is no longer there. It's not, at least not in its same form. Look at the last one. Death. Death would end a listing agreement. There is a gotcha test question in here. And it really is a gotcha.
If there's a contract?
No, well, there's going to be a contract.
It's the death of the firm and not the broker affiliated with the client. That would terminate the agency.
Would the death of the individual broker have any impact on the agency agreement?
No, they'll just pass it to another broker.
No,
They would just pass it off to somebody else in the firm.
because the agreement's with the firm.
Because the agreement's with the firm. So on a test, you got to be really careful, because what they'll know you'll do is you'll remember, oh, death. That terminates agency. And they'll put an answer choice in there that says, Thomas, the listing agent, passes away of a massive heart attack. And what does this do to the listing agreement? The answer is absolutely nothing. Because the listing agreement wasn't with Thomas, it was with Thomas's firm. That makes sense for everybody? Okay? That's definitely a gotcha question on the test.
But if there's a purchase contract with the seller and the seller dies, you still have to see that through, right?
Right. So that's a different question. When the rules for sales agreements, purchase contracts are different than the rules for agency agreements.
Got it.
So, and a sales contract with a buyer and seller does survive death, but an agency agreement does not.
Got it.
Travis, there are 3 things in the chat that I would like you to answer instead of me. Terry asked, if it's mutual, does a contract have to be signed to terminate?
So, Terry, my answer to that, do we need a written agreement to terminate a written agreement would be yes. Remember, the only thing that created this agency in the first place was a written agreement. So the only way to terminate it, if we have a mutual agreement, is with another written agreement saying that we both want out. What else we got?
Latasha, what was meant by operation of law? I think Ethan answered that, but
operation of law is a lawsuit, is a court order. So if court says you don't have a listing agreement anymore, you don't have a listing agreement anymore. I don't even begin to want to get into the reasons why a court might do that. Don't even care. If a judge says you don't have an agency agreement, you don't have an agency agreement. That's what operational law means.
And then can you just please repeat what you said on destruction of condemnation of property?
Yep. So if the property is destroyed or condemned, remember condemnation is eminent domain. If the property is destroyed or condemned, then any listing agreement, buyer agency agreement's a little more iffy because it really doesn't deal with a property, but especially listing agreements would go away if the property was destroyed. Because with a listing agreement, you're hired as a firm to sell this thing, but this thing would no longer exist because the property has been condemned or destroyed. So like we list the house for sale and a week later a tornado comes along and tears it down. That's going to end the listing agreement, that destruction of the property. I think that clears them all up, right, Seth?
Yes, it does.
Okay, good. Good. So that's how we end an agency. And I always go back to completion. That's the best way. Because of all the ones on here, this is the only one that I get what?
A.
A. This is the only one that gets you paid is when you terminate it with a completion. All right. So let's talk about the different types of relationships that we might have in sales. We're not talking about rentals right now. We're talking strictly about sales transactions. What are the different relationships that we might have when we're representing either a buyer or a seller? Now remember, the relationship is always between the client and the firm. So when we look at these four possibilities, and these are the four possibilities, these are the ways in which a firm can represent a seller, or the ways in which a firm can represent a buyer, or both. So we want to take a look at each one and what the differences are between them. Let's talk about exclusive agency. Every transaction has a buyer side and a seller side. Can I go over again the difference between a sales agreement and an agency agreement and the death of a client? Yes and no. We're not talking about sales contracts. We're not talking about sales contracts. We're talking about agency agreements. Don't run them together in your brain. They are two different things. Agency agreements end if there is the death of one party or the other, period. If the firm dies or the client dies, an agency agreement ends. Other contracts do not work that way. Almost every other contract survives death, meaning your estate will follow through with the contract even if you're dead and you're not here. But agency agreements are different because they are personal services type contracts. You can't perform a service if you're dead. You can't pay for a service if you're dead. And so death would terminate agency agreements, but it would not in a sales contract.
Was this for Barbara's question?
It is.
Okay.
So every transaction has a buyer side and seller side. We're talking about sales transactions right now. Every sales transaction has a buyer side and a seller side. And I like to think of every transaction as a tug of war. Buyers pull in one direction, sellers pull in the other direction. And the rope is kind of the contract between them. It's the thing that ties them together. When you look at this picture, what do you immediately notice about just the visual image of this picture? Like if you came across this, what would you say?
The seller has more people on
Fair.
their side.
One-sided.
This is very one-sided. It's not fair, right? That's what exclusive agency looks like. Exclusive agency looks very unfair. If you're dating one person, how many people are you dating?
One.
Or if you're dating, I didn't say that. If you're dating exclusively, how many people are you dating?
One.
One. At least that they know about. I'm kidding. I didn't mean. If you're dating exclusively, you're dating one person. That's what exclusive agency means, except not one person or one dating, one firm. Exclusive agency means one firm. And that firm is on one side. Exclusive agency means one firm on one side. Look at this picture again with new eyes now. Which party has exclusive representation in this picture, the buyer or the seller?
Seller.
The seller does. The seller's got help. Buyers out there by themselves. That's what an exclusive agency transaction looks like. So whenever you have exclusive seller agency, it's the seller who has help. And the buyer's out there by themselves, unrepresented. Is there anything wrong with this transaction from a legal or ethical standpoint, or is this okay?
It's okay.
It's okay. It's okay. Nothing wrong with this.
How is that okay?
What do you mean, how's it okay?
Like, I mean, it just seems unfair to the buyer that they're
I didn't
not.
say anything about fair. I said from a legal or ethical standpoint, is it okay?
I mean,
It's not fair. Clearly, it's not.
I mean, ethically, I wouldn't feel comfortable about it though.
Here's the thing, and this is an important conversation to have. Agency is not fair. If you are an agent, especially an exclusive seller's agent, whose best interest have you been hired to protect?
The sellers. The
Seller.
sellers.
So let me ask this question as a follow-up. What's in the best interest of the seller? That the buyer stays over there by themselves, or that they also get help? What's in the best interest of the seller?
By themselves.
By themselves.
Buyer that saves himself.
Caveat
Buyer stays by
emptor.
themselves.
What'd you say? Caveat emptor?
Caveat emptor, buyer beware. This is the perfect transaction from the seller's perspective. So if you've been hired as a seller's agent, this is exactly what you want the transaction to look like. Now, do you know? Now, I'm not saying, Brittany, you're wrong in the sense of, do I think that buyer is likely to get taken advantage of or not get the best possible outcome? Absolutely. I wouldn't think. Here's the thing. If I was on the seller side and I saw the buyer unrepresented, if I didn't think to myself, you stupid, I wouldn't have a very high opinion of myself. Because if I think I'm pretty good and I'm working for the seller and the buyer's got nobody working for them, automatically I assume the seller's going to get taken for a ride on this thing. It's just the way it works. And it's hard sometimes to accept that that's what agency really means. Agency is a team sport. I like to use sports analogies a lot on the sports.
Well, no, I mean, it honestly, the way that you set it up, it's like a game of dodgeball. Like that's literally all I keep thinking of whenever you're going over the rules is a game of dodgeball. You literally have a good, strong team on one side, and on the other side, you may not have a good team, and you could just be out there, you know, trying to dodge all these balls being thrown at you, and then you're just done. Yeah.
Right. So here's the analogy I like to use because I'm a sports guy. I went to school at Carolina. Let's say that Duke and Carolina were scheduled to play basketball tonight. And they walk in the building and Roy comes out with his team and he's ready to play and they're ready to go. And he looks over on the other side of the arena at the bench. And there's Duke's team, but Coach K is gone. He's missing. He's having one of his back nights. He can't make it. He didn't get to his hair dye appointment that day. Y'all know he colors that mess. Nobody's 130 years old and has jet black hair like that. But seriously, if that happened, if Carolina came out and they look over there and they see Coach K's not on the bench, is Roy gonna go, this is not fair? We just, I mean, we can't do that. Or is he gonna be like,
He said, let's play ball.
play ball?
Yeah.
Boys, I'm sorry y'all showed up without a coach, but it's time to play ball. And that's exactly the way this transaction is gonna work. If the buyer shows up without representation, that's the way we're gonna roll. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yeah.
Now, one thing we are going to do to be ethical about it for Brittany is we're going to make sure to tell the buyer. Now, understand, I work for the seller, so don't tell me anything you wouldn't want the seller to know, because I do work for them. So we are going to make sure we take those steps to try to make sure the buyer understands that situation. But this one-sided transaction is absolutely acceptable. And it could go in the other direction. I mean, you know, exclusive seller agency means only the seller has representation. And remember we said when that happens, we refer to those agents as subagents of the seller. Remember that phrasing from earlier? We said that subagents of the seller just means these are the people who work for the firm that was hired by who?
Seller.
By the seller. Could it be in reverse? Do we have exclusive buyer agency? What do you think?
Sure.
Yeah. Exclusive buyer agency, still one firm on one side, but this time instead of on the seller side, that one firm is on whose side?
The buyers.
The buyer side. For sale by owner transactions happen like this a lot, where the buyer may have representation, the buyer may have hired a firm to represent them, and the seller doesn't have representation. Now, this is much less common, but it could happen. Marilyn asked, is that why agencies ask buyers if they have a broker? Yes. It's a really important question, because if you are representing a seller and here's the buyer and they don't have an agent with them, you need to find out if they have an agent, because we should always respect the relationships that other firms have with their clients. If another firm has a buyer agency agreement with this person, we shouldn't even be having a conversation directly with the buyer. Who should we be talking to?
The agent. The agent.
Sub-agent of the buyer.
Their representative. That's why they have one. And so if I ask a buyer, if a buyer just showed up at one of my listings, I said, are you working with an agent? Oh yeah, I have a buyer's agent. I said, well, then have them give me a call.
Right.
Have them give me a call. So we could have exclusive buyer agency. We could also have this transaction, which has become much more common. Still have seller side, buyer side. Same thing. But visually, what do you notice about this one?
It's equally represented.
Much more balanced, much more equal. How many firms do you think we have here?
Two.
Two firms. Two different firms. One over here, one over here.
So to be considered co-broker transaction, the firms do have to be different from each other. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. To be considered a co-broker transaction, you're talking about two different firms.
Okay.
Not one firm on both sides.
Right.
Two different firms. One representing the seller, one representing the buyer. We also call this a cooperative transaction. Co-brokerage, cooperative mean the same thing. The name comes from the fact that the two firms are cooperating with one another. Information is flowing back and forth between the two firms in the transaction. What else are they cooperating on? What else is probably getting shared in addition to information?
Commission.
Money. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Money's getting shared. Because I'll tell you how, let me change colors. I'll do a green line here if I can. Let's talk about the money. Who's probably going to pay the commission?
Seller.
The seller.
The money starts there, does it not?
Yep.
And who do they pay?
The firm.
Their listing firm.
They pay their listing
Their
firm.
listing.
So now the listing firm's got money. How does the buyer's agent's firm normally get paid?
From the listing
From the
firm.
listing firm.
From the buyer?
Well, they could get paid from the buyer. Where do you think they're going to try to get paid first from?
Seller.
The seller's agent.
From the seller's agent, right? Could money flow this way?
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Usually, it's this or this. Could it be both, though? Could it be some combination of both paying the buyer side?
Yes.
It could be. It could be. But the most common path is this one right here. From the seller to the listing agent or listing firm. Now I'm going to erase some of these so I can talk to you about some terminology here. If you haven't already noticed it, there's some terminology on here that you haven't seen yet. And I will tell you that for most people in the class, it's the most frustrating terminology of the entire class. There's one you've already seen. We've already talked about this idea of the listing firm, right? And we said the listing firm is the firm representing who?
The
seller.
The seller. The listing firm represents the seller. What we haven't yet talked about, what we haven't yet talked about is this terminology. The selling firm.
Represents the buyer.
Well, Sheila, yes and no. Sheila said the selling firm represents the buyer. It could. Here's the better way to say it. The selling firm produces the buyer.
Yep.
The selling firm brings the buyer to the table. They produce the buyer. Could I produce a buyer that I don't represent?
Yep.
Yes.
Yes.
For example, if I'm holding an open house at one of my listings, who do I represent?
Seller.
The seller.
The seller, right?
Yeah.
Buyer wanders in, they don't have an agent. Can I help them write an offer on that property?
Yes.
Can I help them write an offer without representing them?
Yep.
Yeah, I just tell them, hey, I represent the seller, and we'll write the offer up. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yep.
I am both the listing agent and the selling agent at that point. So the selling agent might be a buyer's agent, but it might not. Here's what we know. Selling agent brought the buyer to the party. Here's where the terminology comes from. Maybe it'll help you remember. The terminology comes from the fact that firms represent clients, and sometimes two different agents in the firm had something to do with it. So I want you to imagine that before buyer agency existed, Anna has this listing, and she gets another agent in the firm to hold an open house. Can that happen? Can you get another agent in your firm to hold an open house at one of your listings? Yeah.
Yes.
So Anna's got the listing, and she gets Danya to hold the open house, and they're affiliated with the same firm. And Danya gets a buyer who comes in there, wants to buy it, makes an offer. Buyer doesn't have an agent. Danya represents the seller, because remember, every agent that's affiliated with the listing firm represents the seller. Danya helps the buyer write up the offer. Buyer says, I'm fine with you being a seller's agent. I'm okay with that. Everybody following me so far? When that paperwork comes in the office, do you think Danya's going to want to get paid something? What do you think?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, she found a buyer. Here's how the broker in charge is going to differentiate the two. Who are we paying on this transaction? Well, Anna was the listing agent, so you got to pay her. Okay, well, who sold the thing? The one that sold it? The one that brought the buyer? We call them the selling agent. So the selling agent, the selling firm, is the agent or firm who produces the buyer. Whether they represent them or not, they brought them. That make sense? Okay. So, but in a co-brokered transaction, how many firms do you have?
Two.
Two. So in a co-brokered transaction, it is a fair statement to say, Sheila, that the selling firm is the one of the two that represents the buyer, because the buyer has representation. If the buyer has representation, then yes, the selling firm is the buyer's firm. But in any transaction, the selling firm is the firm that brought the buyer. Candace wants to know, is this dual agency? No. We have not discussed dual agency yet. We have not in any way discussed a situation where the firm has agreed to represent both parties. Just because the firm is working with both parties does not mean the firm is representing both parties. If Danya is holding an open house because her firm has the listing, then she is representing the seller. If a buyer comes in who does not have representation, Danya can simply say, well, I just want to remind you, I represent the seller. What can I help you with? And if the buyer wants to make an offer, more power to them. They don't have to have representation. By the way, as a listing firm, it's the best kind of transaction. If you're the listing firm, don't you love an unrepresented buyer? Think about it.
Yes.
I don't have to share your commission with anybody.
There's nobody to share with. You only share your commission if there's somebody to share with. There's only somebody to share with if there's another firm involved in the transaction. So as a listing firm, you would certainly prefer it to be an exclusive agency transaction rather than a co-brokered transaction. That's another mistake people make. They try to think of commissions in two pieces. They're not. The commission, all of it is paid by who in most transactions?
Seller.
To who?
The listing firm.
To the listing firm. And then the listing firm shares it if they want to, and if there's someone to share it with.
So Travis,
Have to be.
question for you.
Okay.
So say you come to the listing firm and you say, listen, I'm an unrepresented buyer, but I'm going to come here unrepresented, but I want the 3% of the commission as a rebate.
Mm-hmm.
That's perfectly legal, right?
It is perfectly legal. You know what else is perfectly legal?
For them to say no.
For them to say no.
And they don't have to tell the seller that they're telling them no either, do they?
No, as a matter of fact, not only do they not have to tell the seller that that conversation occurred, they shouldn't tell the seller that conversation occurred, because one of the things we're not supposed to do is to interject commission into the conversation of an offer. If the buyer wants to make an offer, the buyer makes an offer. And that offer is not dictated based on any type of commission whatsoever. because the commission is an agreement between the seller and the listing firm. The buyer has no idea what, if any, commission is being paid by the seller to the listing firm. And so there's no way for the buyer to, make that part of their offer. They can certainly ask, they can certainly say, hey, well, were you paying a buyer's agent? Will you be willing to give me that as a rebate? And some firms might be willing to do that, and that's fine. I'm not saying it's good, bad, or indifferent, but it is illegal for the buyer to ask, and it's illegal for the listing firm to say no.
Interesting. What about having a buyer's agent and saying, listen, I want this house, but I already know I want the house. So I just want you to close the deal. So I want you to take your commission and rebate most of it back to me. And in exchange, I'll give you 1/3 of the commission because you're sealing the deal and representing me.
That's why you have a buyer agency agreement. And that's why you have a discussion about compensation on the buyer agency agreement. If that's the agreement you want to have between the buyer and the buyer's firm, then there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And
aren't you surprised that we haven't seen this happen? I guess more accelerated, especially given things like Zillow and stuff like that, because it seems to me like people that are in the know about this, instead of, either going to get a real estate agent license, like myself, to say, what, I'm going to save myself all this commission, or they would go ahead and find a buyer's agent or a seller's agent to say, we're going to keep things on the cheap here. And
well, I think it's like anything else. Like, look how tedious this explanation is for people who are actually in it taking the class. Quite honestly, I don't even think there's any active hiding of it going on. I just think the general public is completely brain dumb.
Wow. When
it comes to how compensation and commission works, and they don't really understand it, and so they don't approach it.
Right.
And I don't even mean that in an insulting way. It's just not something that's in people's mindsets, so they don't ever open the discussion.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you for that explanation. That helps me a lot. I didn't, I think a lot of agents will insinuate to their clients that they can't share the commission or anything like that. And I don't know.
Which is unfortunate, because that's not true. And I think that whatever your answer, I think it's fine for somebody who wants to rebate back to, a buyer's agent who wants to rebate back to the clients. I think that's fine. I think it's fine for buyer's agents who want to say no. What I don't think is fine is sort of making up excuses that don't exist. Oh, well, the real estate commission doesn't allow me to do that. That's a lie. The real estate commission doesn't say anything about that. They don't care what you do with the commission in that regard. Oh, well, the standard commission is this. That's a felony. There is no such thing as a standard commission. If you just don't want to rebate, then that's what you should say to a buyer who asks you about rebating, which is, I'm sorry, but I don't rebate commissions. To me, that's the most important thing, Jeffrey, is just that we all be very straightforward and honest with an approach, not, as you sort of said, like insinuate that there's something preventing them from doing it.
Right. Well, thank you, Travis. I appreciate that explanation.
Yeah, you're welcome. Go ahead, Elizabeth. I saw Elizabeth's hand. Let me grab her, and then I'll
just really quickly. So I get that the selling firm can be representing the buyer if the buyer is represented.
Correct.
Okay, but if the buyer is not represented, is the selling firm representing the seller ever? Or,
yes.
I mean, what? Okay.
If there's only one firm in the transaction, then that firm is very likely the listing firm and the selling firm, because their listing always means they represent the seller.
Yeah, but there's no legal relationship between the listing firm and the selling firm, or is there?
Correct. There is none, other than sharing commissions.
Okay.
If they're two separate firms, then the only relationship between the two of them is sharing commissions. Of course, if they're the same firm, then there's no sharing. You don't share with yourself.
Right. And so if there is no buyer representation, listing firm and selling firm are one and the same. And
that is correct.
This issue. Okay.
That is correct. So a good way to say it is sort of what you're hinting at, which is there's always a listing firm and always a selling firm, even when they are the same firm.
Right.
They could be two separate firms if you're dealing with a co-broker transaction, though, because there's always a firm that brings the seller and a firm that brings the buyer. And that's how we label them, as listing and selling. If you brought the seller to the table, you're the listing firm. If you brought the buyer to the table, you're the selling firm. If you brought both of them to the table, then you are both the listing firm and the selling firm.
That's great. Thank you.
You're welcome. I think Deborah had a question, maybe?
Yes, regarding commission, is that something, since you're working for the firm, is that something that you have to run through the BIC before you start negotiating, like rebates or whatever?
Absolutely. Great question. And yes, some firms give their affiliated licensees the ability to freely negotiate commissions any way they want to. Some firms have set amounts. This is what we charge, and you can't deviate from that without talking to the broker in charge. So that's all about, consult with your broker in charge and figure out what authority you have or don't have as far as negotiating commissions goes. Yeah, that's an internal discussion.
Ethan has a question.
Ethan, you have a question?
Yeah, I'm just curious. So, like, my sister owns a real estate company, and of course, she has like 4 offices, so she has like 4 brokers in charge. So, like, but she's also considered a broker in charge. It doesn't take that role in the business. So, like, I know like you have to be under a broker in charge for 2 years in order to like take the class to get your broker in charge license.
Right.
Could I be under her, or do I have to be under an active broker in charge?
Anybody who's willing to supervise your activities. So you can be supervised by anybody who meets the criteria for being a broker in charge.
Okay.
Yep. Okay. Do we all get this distinction in a co-brokered transaction about there being 2 firms, one on each side? So we've gone from only one side having representation to now both sides having representation. Is everybody okay with that? I hope you're okay with that, because we're about to build into, we say the best or worst, depending on your perspective, for last. Before we get into it, though, I want to point out something about buyer agency. Seller agency is very easy to understand, like I mentioned earlier. The rules for seller agency are very crystal clear. If you want to represent a seller, you need a written listing agreement. I'm going to say that again. If you want to represent a seller, if your firm wants to represent a seller, you need a written listing agreement right from Jump Street. Like, word go, we need a written listing agreement. You can't do anything on behalf of a seller without a written listing agreement. You can't put a sign in the yard. You can't put it on the MLS. You can't tell everybody in your office, hey, I got this new listing coming up. You can't tell people outside your office, oh, I'm going to have a new listing in that neighborhood, until you have what in place?
A written agreement.
A written listing agreement. Crystal clear rules. The buyer side, as always, much more confusing side. The Real Estate Commission, and this is North Carolina specific. Okay, this is not national section. This would be North side, North Carolina. This would be in the NC section. The North Carolina Real Estate Commission allows buyer agency to be oral for a limited amount of time, meaning you can begin the process with a buyer without a written agreement. What would beginning the process look like? You can start to do what?
Show houses, show properties.
You can show them property. You can talk to them about what their needs are. You can send them listings. You can take them and do showings. You could even tell them, this is what I think the value of the property is. This is what I think you should offer. You can give advice. You can do all of that with an oral agreement. What you can't do with an oral agreement, cannot do with an oral agreement, is make an offer on behalf of that buyer. Here's the rule, and I'm going to give you the rule, and then you're going to have to make it work in your own head. If you're writing up an offer on the property, you have to have an agency agreement in writing with somebody in order to write up that offer. I'm going to say that one more time, make sure you got it. If you're writing up an offer to purchase, then your firm has to have an agency agreement in writing with somebody, either the buyer or the seller, in order to do that. Here's the thing. If you put a buyer in your car and you're taking them and you're showing them other firms' listings, you following me so far? You're showing them other firms' listings. You can do that with an oral agreement. They want to make an offer. Do you have an agency agreement at that point in time with anybody?
No.
No, you don't have one with the seller because you're not the listing firm. And you don't have one yet with who?
The buyer.
The buyer. The rules in North Carolina say you can't present an offer unless you have agency with somebody, either the seller or the buyer. So since you're not going to be on the seller side, since you're showing other people's listings, at that point in time, the only way you can proceed with an offer, writing an offer, presenting an offer, is if you get a what?
Agreement with the buyer.
An agreement with the buyer.
In writing.
A buyer agency agreement in writing in order to proceed from that point forward. Is everybody with me on that? Now, here's what I don't want you to confuse, because you might see this in the test, you may see this in the real world. I did not say you always need a buyer agency agreement to write an offer for a buyer. I said you need an agency agreement with one party or the other before. If you're already the listing firm, can you write up an offer for a buyer?
Yes. Yes.
Yes. You don't need a buyer agency agreement. You already have agency in the transaction with the seller. There's no need for a buyer agency agreement. Unless you also want to represent the buyer, but you already represent somebody in the transaction, so you're free to write up and present an offer. But if you find yourself in the position, because I know I'm really going after this rule, but I want to make sure it sinks in. If you find yourself in the position of, here's a buyer, they want to make an offer, and I don't have agency with anybody right now. I don't have agency with the seller, and I don't have agency with the buyer. Stop. You cannot proceed at that point unless you get a written buyer agency agreement. Does that make sense for everybody? That's the rule. That's the rule. So
you have to ask the buyer, if you're the listing agent and the buyer has no agreement, you have to ask them, are you in any agreement with any other realtor at this time?
You should. You should always ask that, because if their answer is yes, then you don't want to be talking to the buyer. You want to be talking to their agent.
Okay.
That's one of the main reasons you always ask.
Do we ask, though, if they're in an agreement or if they have a buyer's agent?
I ask, are you working with an agent?
Okay. Because I was going to say that almost could be two different.
They are two different things, but I try not to get into that level or depth of discussion with a buyer, because they may try to give you misleading answers. So I always use, are you working with another agent? Well, yeah, sort of. What's their name? What's their phone number? I will give them a call. And I call the agent. And the first thing I'm going to ask the agent, I'm going to put the agent on the spot. See that question that you're really wondering about? I'm going to ask the agent, because as soon as they answer the phone, I'm going to say, I'm standing here with Jory, and she says she's been working with you. Do you have a written buyer agency agreement with her? I'm going to ask the question explicitly to the agent. And if they do, then the conversation is going to continue with them. If they don't, then I can decide how I want the conversation to continue. You know, because they don't have any written. Does that make sense, Jordan?
I have another question on the slide before with seller agreement.
Yeah.
You can't put a sign in the ground. But earlier you talked about taking photos, having your photographer take photos of a house before you were in a listing agreement.
Mm-hmm.
What things are allowed Or is that something we're gonna cover later?
Nothing public facing.
Public facing, okay. So
Right.
you get the pictures, but you can't post them until you have an agreement.
Exactly.
Okay,
That's exactly right. Can't market or tell the public or in any way indicate that the property is for sale or available until you have a written listing agreement.
thank you.
Yep. Okay. Are we good on this rule about buyer agency and when it must be put into writing?
I think so.
So another way to say this is we can do oral buyer agency for a limited amount of time, up to the point of making an offer on behalf of that buyer. And then we have to put it in writing if we want to continue. At that point, there's no doubt, put it in writing. Because again, you kind of want to get paid. And remember, the only way you can get paid is if you have a buyer agency agreement and what? In writing. Your agency agreement's always got to be in writing to be entitled to compensation. So you need a written agreement. And a lot of people would say, and I would be one of them, if you're getting to the time of offer and you still wondering, do I need a written agreement? In my opinion, you probably waited too late. I mean, like, that's really flying close to the sun, like waiting that long. Because remember, oral buyer agency, and you'll see this on a test, is not exclusive. If you're in oral buyer agency, you're in an open relationship. That's different than an exclusive relationship. If you're in an open relationship, how many people are you dating?
A lot.
As you want.
As many as you want. And that is exactly what the buyer has when you're doing oral buyer agency. They have the ability to go and deal with as many real estate firms as they would like, because there is no such thing as a binding oral agency agreement. It doesn't exist. So they're not tied to you. They're not tied to any particular amount of time. You're not owed a commission until you get an agency agreement in writing. Now, I will point out that is different, dramatically different than how buyer agency is practiced in some other states. A lot of other states, and you may as well write this phrase down. I'll put it up here on a separate screen for you. You might as well write this phrase down. A lot of other states practice this idea practice this idea that the firm that starts the chain of events that leads to a transaction is entitled to a commission. We in North Carolina do not practice that. In North Carolina, to get paid, getting paid is always equal to a written agreement. Some states, in fact, a lot of them, practice this idea that they try to look for the firm who did the work and figure out who earned the commission. That is not something we practice in the state of North Carolina. So on a test in North Carolina, if you were ever presented with this idea that one firm is doing all the work, but another firm has a written agreement, which firm's going to get paid the compensation?
The written agreement.
A written agreement.
The one with the written agreement. The one with the written agreement. Okay. So just FYI, if you happen to encounter that disconnect on the test, North Carolina, we pay you if you have a written agreement. So that's a little bit different about buyer agency. Now let's, I'm sorry.
You said in North Carolina, getting paid is,
It's all tied to the written agreement.
Okay.
It's all
Thank you.
tied to the written agreement in North Carolina.
Thank you.
We don't try to look at who caused the transaction, who began the chain of events, who started the ball rolling downhill, all those kinds of things. We don't do it that way as far as payment of commissions goes.
Thank you.
So far, we've talked about 3 different possibilities when it comes to agency relationships in a sales transaction. We have talked about exclusive agency, which means we have how many firms?
One
firm on how many sides?
One side.
On one side of the transaction or the other. That's exclusive representation. We talked about, and you could have exclusive buyer agency, exclusive seller agency. We talked about co-brokered transactions, which introduced the idea of how many firms being involved?
2.
2 firms, one on each side. So we moved to both parties having representation. Now we want to talk about one firm on 2 sides. We want to talk about the possibility of having one real estate firm represent both sides of the transaction at the same time. That is called dual agency. Now, I will tell you, this is a pretty big departure for how other states practice dual agency and how North Carolina practices things. We're going to talk about this from the North Carolina perspective, and I'm going to hope that you don't see many dual agency questions on the national section of the exam. We've been told they try to stay away from that because there are such significant differences in how it's practiced. The only thing I couldn't live with myself if I thought I led you down the wrong road and you made a mistake in the real world when it comes to agency. So I'm going to talk about dual agency from the North Carolina perspective of things and how we define dual agency and how dual agency works in this state. The most important word in this entire definition is right here. When a what agrees to represent both the buyer and the seller at the same time in the same transaction.
The same firm.
A firm, not an agent, not a person, not a broker, but a firm. This is the most important idea you can take away from today. That anytime a buyer and a seller who are in a transaction together, so the buyer is buying the seller's property, and the buyer has representation, yes, they got somebody looking out for them. The seller has representation, yes, they have somebody looking out for them. And that representation comes from the same office. That is considered dual agency in North Carolina. Now, we got to define a firm because otherwise you'll never get the definition for dual agency.
Would this be where sub-agents comes into play?
It is, for sure. Sub-agents always come into play, but it's more important in dual agency, Justine, than it is any other time. So that's a good point. Let's define a firm. A firm in North Carolina is a physical office location. Here's what that means. Could you have Keller Williams representing the buyer and Keller Williams representing the seller, but that actually be 2 different firms?
Yes.
Yes, because The Keller Williams location that's representing the buyer could be a different physical location than the Keller Williams location representing the seller. Does that make sense for everybody? Because they are different physical locations, they will have different brokers in charge. A broker in charge is not allowed to supervise more than one physical location. Because they have different brokers in charge, they are considered different firms. Even if they are owned by the same people, even if they have the same like trade name, it doesn't matter. They're two different locations, they're two different firms. So Keller Williams Briar Creek and Keller Williams Raleigh, two different firms, two different offices. That's not dual agency if one is on one side of the transaction and the other is on the other side. That is a co-brokered transaction. But it is dual agency whenever there are two brokers, two agents, two licensees affiliated with the same broker in charge, working the same transaction, one representing the buyer and one representing the seller. At the end of the day, it's not the brokers who got hired. It's who did the buyer hire?
The firm.
Who did the seller hire?
The firm.
And it's all the same firm, so that's dual agency. Does that definition make sense based on our discussion from the rest of the day?
So dual agency
firms are big enough that have two brokers in charge?
Well, are there firms big enough that they have two brokers in charge? Technically speaking, there's no limitation on numbers of agents that a broker in charge could supervise. Could a firm decide that internally they want to split into two different firms and have two different brokers in charge? They could, but they would be two different firms at that point in time.
Okay.
Firm means everybody who's under the supervision of that broker in charge. That's the firm.
Could there ever be like two broker in charges supervising one huge firm?
There can be, but they're going to be the word firm there is used incorrectly, because what you're really referring to is one business structure. Firm is a legal terminology in North Carolina, and firm means everybody under the supervision of one broker in charge. So as soon as you say, oh, well, that firm has two brokers in charge, I would say to you, then you use the wrong form of the word firm, because you use the singular form when you should have been using the plural one. Because if there's two BICs, then how many firms do we have?
Two
firms. And that would not be considered dual agency. Because if there's two different BICs, that means there's two different supervision structures. That means the agents don't answer to the same people. That means they're not getting supervision and guidance from the same people. So there's no reason that should be a conflict of interest.
I have a question.
Go for it,
just
Debbie.
to get my simple mind. Okay, so you're talking about dual agent. It's one firm. Will they would never, or would they let one agent handle both sides?
That's a very good question, because that's actually how most states define dual agency. In most states, dual agency is one person who's working both sides of the transaction. In North Carolina, yes, we do allow that form of dual agency as well. Unfortunately, people start to think that's the only thing that's dual agency, and that's simply not true. In North Carolina, we have a much bigger definition of what is considered dual agency. Dual agency could be Joy represents the buyer and Joy represents the seller. That's dual agency.
Okay.
But dual agency could also be Joy and Jeffrey both work for HPW Strickland Road, and Joy is representing the buyer and Jeffrey is representing the seller, because they're both affiliated with the same firm. That's still dual agency. Okay. And the rules are going to be exactly the same, even though they're two different situations. The rules are going to be exactly the same in North Carolina.
But wouldn't if you have one person, somebody's going to get slighted. And it
No
seems like,
question.
yeah.
And that's why I get on my soapbox about dual agency. It's my soapbox thing. I hate it. I hate it with a passion that would burn a hole through the floor. It runs counterintuitive to everything I believe about the business, everything I believe about representing clients' best interests. I'm going to tell you, I was really rude to a lady a couple years ago in class, and I didn't mean to be rude, but I was so trying to prove this point. Because let me tell you why dual agency happens a lot. The money. It's monetarily driven, especially with agents that have been in the business a long time. If you were in the business in the 80s, even the early 90s, before buyer agency existed, how much of the commission did you get to keep on your transactions?
All of it.
All of it. Folks don't give up money easily. They have looked and scraped and clawed to figure out ways to keep all of it. And so as more buyers started to demand representation, they just said to themselves, well, hell, I'll just represent both of them. That way I get to keep all the money. Here's the problem with that. And it's exactly what you pointed out. Somebody's going to get slighted. That is the humanity of the thing. And that's the problem with dual agency. Dual agency puts the entire firm into this conflict of interest. Not just the individual broker in the conflict of interest, but the whole firm is put into this situation of how do we serve two masters? Because if you think about a transaction. And you see, sometimes in a bubble, it's easy to say, oh, I could be that, I could do that, I could be fair. Really?
Can't.
Because when you think about it, aren't transactions like a tug of war, like I said?
Yeah.
If it's good for the buyer, who's it bad for?
The seller.
The seller, and vice versa. If it's good for the seller, it's bad for the buyer. There's no way we can represent opposing best interest. Imagine this, because I always compare it back to attorneys, right? I shouldn't compare us to attorneys. God, it makes us seem awful. No. But I always compare us to attorneys. Can you imagine? I want you to imagine this. Imagine.
I know where you're going.
If you had been accused of a crime and you hired the best defense attorney you could find. I mean, this girl is good. She's got a reputation, boy, she just knocks it out of the park. And you've hired the best defense attorney you can find. And you go in court, you feeling good that day.
I know she's the freaking DA too.
and as soon as you get in court and they call court to session, and the judge says, does the state have any opening remarks? And your attorney stands up, the one you hired and paid, and says, Your Honor, we intend to prove that Miss Rose committed this heinous crime and she is guilty of all charges and she should spend the next 20 years in prison. And you sitting there going, wait a minute.
WTH.
You're my attorney. And then and she looks at you, she goes, no, hold on, I got you. It's okay, it's okay. And then after she says all that, and the judge says, well, does the defense have any opening remarks? And the same person goes, Your Honor, everything I just said was a lie. You don't believe anything I just said because this person is so innocent. In any other business, we would say that's insanity.
Yeah.
We would say that's crazy. You can't represent the best interest of both parties at the same time.
Yeah. I was in this situation about 4 or 5 years ago. I was going to buy a house, and this one guy, he had listed it, and I talked to him about it, and he was going to play both. And when we were negotiating, I would tell him something, and I'm thinking, how could this be fair? You know, it's before I knew anything. I'm like, he cannot actually pretend to represent that guy's best interest in mine too.
Right. Well,
he's trying to get more money out of me.
And that's it. Most of the time when it happens. Now we're going to talk a lot more about this. We're far from done about this topic, but here's what I was saying, and we're going to take a quick break because I know I owe you a break. with dual agency, we have to accept that we can't do a good job for either client. Because doing a good job for one would mean we had done a disservice to the other. I mean, if we do, somebody said to me one time, and I'll tell you the story about the lady I was rude to in just a second. But somebody said to me one time, they're like, my clients think I do a great job, even the dual agency ones. I said, I can't think of a worse thing that my clients could say about me after a dual agency transaction is that I did a good job for them.
Mm-hmm.
Because if that were true, then that means by necessity I did a bad job for the other side. If I did a great job for the sellers, I did a bad job for who?
The buyer.
For the buyers, and vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
Here's what so basically, here's the rule. The rule is when you're in dual agency, you don't give any advice. Because we know the advice can't be fair. We know you can't give advice for the best thing. You're just not supposed to give any at all.
But isn't that what you're hired to do in the first place?
Well, there's the big question. Like, well,
Yeah.
what are we actually doing now, right?
Yeah.
But that's the real estate commission's rule. Because it's such a big conflict of interest, you're not supposed to give any advice at all. And here's what I want you to think about while you're on the break. When we come back, I'll tell you the story about the lady I insulted. But I want you to think about this while we're on the break. If we're in dual agency, and remember, it's the firm that's in dual agency, right? Not the individual broker, but the whole firm.
Mm-hmm.
It's the whole firm that represents the buyer and the seller, the whole physical office location, however many agents they got affiliated. Every single one of them represents the buyer, and every single one of them represents the seller. Here's the rule. Nobody can give advice. Nobody.
Screw that.
Nobody. 120 agents. How many of them are giving advice?
Nobody. Not one.
None of them.
Nobody. None.
Well, that's just a firm of nothingness.
Because the rule says if the firm is a dual agent, then the firm has a conflict of interest, and therefore the firm cannot give advice. Well, the firm is everybody. And so I want you to think about that. We're going to take a quick break. It's 3 o'clock now. We'll come back at 3:10. But I want you to take, while on this break, I want you to think about, like, what are the implications of that in a big real estate firm? If you're in a big real estate firm, how often is that going to happen where you have the firm representing both the buyer and the seller at the same time in the same transaction, and you can't give advice? So think on that, and we'll come back and see what you say about it. Okay? So come back at 3:10.
Hey, Travis.
Yes.
There was a couple people who were a little confused on dual agency, so I'm just gonna throw your dual agency video in there.
That's fine, and we're still continuing this discussion. Big time.
Okay,
After
awesome.
we come back, we ain't leaving dual agency for a while.
All right, thank you.
Yep. So, before the break, I mentioned how when we get into dual agency, we're talking about an entire firm, which is everybody under the supervision of one broker in charge. So think back to our exercise this morning that we started with. Each one of your groups was a firm. You all decided on a broker in charge and named your firm. You had 8 or 10 people that were in there who were all affiliated with that firm. So the way we define dual agency in North Carolina is any of those 8 or 10 people representing the seller, and any of those 8 or 10 people also representing the buyer at the same time in the same transaction. We don't mean a firm that's representing a buyer who's buying 123 Main Street and a seller who's selling 566 Elm Street. That's two separate transactions. We're talking about the seller of 123 Main Street and the buyer of 123 Main Street are both represented by the same firm. It can be one person or two different people within the firm. It doesn't matter. Either one is considered dual agency. Well, let me ask you a question. And this is the question I asked you to ponder when you went to break. Is that going to impact big firms more than it does small firms? Is it more likely that a big firm would end up representing both the buyer and the seller at the same time in a transaction? What do y'all think?
Yes,
Why?
because they have a larger pool of agents working for them.
Just odds are, right? Just the odds are higher. I mean, if you've got 10 agents, okay, the odds are not that big that you'll end up with a buyer and a seller who are on the same transaction. But if you've got 110 or 210 or 500, we have firms with 500 agents in North Carolina. If a firm has 500 agents, this is going to happen all the time. So we need to talk about what the rules are for dual agency. How do we proceed when we're dual agents? What do we say the first rule was going to be? In fact, look at the firm in this image we got right here. Look at the firm. What is the firm doing? In every other transaction, the firm is helping pull the rope one way or the other. What are they doing now?
Nothing. They have hands free, hands off.
Hands off. Let the buyer and the seller fight it out. Can't provide help. Can't provide assistance. Can't provide advice. I mean, we can facilitate. Buyer makes an offer. Can we take it and present it to the seller? Can we do that in dual agency? Take the buyer's offer and present it to the seller?
Yes.
Yeah. What if the buyer says, what should I offer? What do we ask? What was our answer to that?
No, but
Can't advise you.
I can't help you.
You can't advise them.
I can't help you with that. Why not? Well, because I also represent the seller. And I'm not going to help them. I'm also not going to help you.
So I have a question. Once these people find out that you can't really advise them the way you normally would if they had their own representation, would they then try and go out and find their own?
Too late.
Wow.
Because they're already in contract.
They're already under contract. They're already under contract. They already have an agency agreement.
But
Now, I'm sorry.
You can wait until the time goes out on it.
You could, but the property might not still be available then.
True.
It's a hot market. You wait, property may not still be available. So this is a no-win situation all the way around. Now, there are times, so people ask me, why is it legal? Well, it's legal because sometimes it's unavoidable. Sometimes it just happens. And we have to have guidelines for how we deal with it when it just happens. But there's a big difference between it just happening sort of naturally and us pushing the envelope, us kind of pushing for it. So it has to be intentionally done. You can't just like, oh my gosh, we're in dual agency. You have to actually have a conversation with the buyer and the seller. And you need their permission. That's what this informed written consent is all about. Informed written consent means they actually need to know what you're selling, what they are approving. They need to know what they're giving you permission to do. They need to understand what they're giving up, because they're giving up a lot. Here's the truth, and I really believe this is true. The vast majority of buyers and sellers to some extent, but buyers in particular, if you truly explain to them dual agency, and you explain to them what they're giving up, they would never say yes to it. They would say no. They would refuse it. I mean, can you imagine? Here's this buyer, and they said, well, you know, I'd like to have a buyer's agent because I really need help. I'm a first-time home buyer, and I need help. And he said, well, I could be your buyer's agent, but I couldn't give you any help. Well, what do you mean? Well, you know, you just kind of be on your own. Well, I mean, I only need help with, like, I just don't know what I should offer. Well, I couldn't give you help with that. You'd be on your own. Really? Well, but, you know, the other thing is I don't know, like, should I get, like, home inspections or stuff like that? Well, I mean, I couldn't help you with that either. You'd have to figure that out on your own, too. You start telling a buyer all that, what are they going to say?
Bye.
Yeah. Well, good for you.
Well, good are you?
Yep.
Right? And that's the reality of it. We have a problem in our industry where it's not really explained very well. And my suspicion is that it happens a lot in dual agency. So I wonder, this not explaining happens a lot in dual agency. I want to tell you that story. The lady I insulted in class a couple years ago. And I really didn't, I didn't set out to be insulting, I really didn't, but she kept challenging me on this point, and it wasn't hitting home with her, because we were having a discussion. It was a CE class, she'd been in the business a long time. And she talked about how much she did dual agency. And I said, okay. And she said, and I think it's the best way to do real estate. And I said, well, I would disagree with you there. Now, I was going to leave it at that. I was content to leave it at that. I said, I would disagree with you there. Well, I don't know why you disagree. Clearly, you don't know how to do it. She got on my nerves when she said that. And I said, I understand how dual agency works, and I understand that I'm better when I'm giving my advice. And she said, well, I'm just telling you, all my clients love me and think I do a great job, whether I'm in dual agency or not. And I said, you really think you're just as good of an agent when you're in dual agency? She said, I do. She said, I think I'm maybe even better when I'm in dual agency. I said, well, let me ask you something. If you're in dual agency and the buyer asks you what they should offer, you know, what do you say? And she said, well, I know I can't help them. I know the rules. You're not going to trap me. She said, I know I can't. I just tell them that they should offer whatever they think is fair. I said, and what if the seller says to you, well, is this a good offer? Should I accept it? Should I make a counter offer? How much should my counter offer be? What do you tell them? Should I tell them the same thing? They just need to come back with whatever they think is fair. I said, so you don't give advice? No. I said, what about repairs? Do the buyers ask you, like, what things you should try to get the seller to fix? She said, all the time. So, and what do you tell them? I tell them I can't help them with that. I said, and you think you're as good of an agent completely not giving advice as you are when you're giving advice? And she said, every bit as good. And I was just beside myself. I didn't know what else to say. And I shouldn't have said what I said, but I did say it. I said, here's all I would say then. You must give really shitty advice. Because to me, isn't that the truth? If you're just as good when you're giving no advice than when you're giving all your advice is not very good in the first place.
Yeah,
true.
I kind of respect my opinion more than that. I kind of think my advice is worthwhile. I would never say to somebody, you're just as good off without my advice as you are with it. No, that's crazy to me.
Unless she's doing something like going around it and not doing it specifically.
Well, that's the thing. What I think she's really doing, and what I suspect, because otherwise I think your clients would always be upset. I think people end up giving advice to both sides. I think people end up advising on both ends, and the clients don't realize that's happening. So the clients are satisfied with, well, yeah, of course you end up looking like a genius every time if you're advising both parties, because you're always going to come to a resolution, because you're telling them both, you know what I'm saying? Like, if the house is listed at $350 and the buyer's like, I don't know, I don't think it's worth that. What do you think I should offer? And you say to the buyer, well, why don't you offer $340 and we'll just see what happens? And then you go present $340 to the seller, and the seller's like, well, I don't know. I mean, they're trying to talk us down on this offer, and you know, what do you think about $340? I think $340 is really fair. Well, of course you're going to come to a resolution. You're giving them both. I mean, that's not what the rule says. Whether you think that's right or not is beyond the point. I can have people, I've had people say, well, there's nothing wrong with that. Well, there is according to the law.
It's still
And that's,
giving growth.
and that's the problem. It's the way the law treats this, not the way we think it should be treated. Are y'all all with me on that? The law said no advice to either side because it is a huge conflict of interest. There is no doubt that this represents both sides having this conflict, and you can't avoid the conflict of interest. And so the only way to handle it is to take it head on and say, look, we recognize we have this conflict of interest, so we're not going to be able to give you either advice. But of course, then, as Beverly pointed out, then the client's going to start asking, well, then what do I have you for anyway? You know, what's the point? Why are you here? Why are you in this problem? And one of the biggest problems we run into is with the disclosure thing. This is where they're going to ask test questions, by the way, about dual agency. One of the areas where they're going to start to pick at you about dual agency and test questions.
Hey, Travis, before we go to this slide, can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm kind of scared to ask this after you have told us that you got onto that lady. So
only because she kept just like,
just a heads up, I'm a little scared to ask this, but so for example, I think I talked to you about it a little bit earlier, but whenever, let's say you have a property management